Okay, welcome back, everyone. Very special guest with us today. This is Ryan Lafferty. Hello, Ryan.
Hello, hello.
So, Ryan, oh my gosh, has done so many different kinds of debate at this point. What I think NYPDL, APTA, BP, probably some others, and has a lot to say about it. So, Ryan has won the World's University Debate Championship in Panama this year, was a semifinalist last year, was the number one individually ranked APTA debaters, the Speaker of the Year last year, and also won the North American Universities Debate Championship in British Parliamentary. So among a million other things, a million other debate tournaments that he's won or top spoke. So he is very experienced, and I'm very happy to have you here, Ryan.
Thank you so much for having me on. I'm very much looking forward. This will be quite entertaining, I'm sure.
Yeah, so the first time I hit you, you were like, I want to say you were like still a high schooler.
Oh,
Uh,
this is true, actually. This is correct. Yeah, this was my senior year of high school, I think. I quasi illegally did an APTA tournament for fun.
Yeah, I've heard that you've maybe done this a few times. I want to hear like what is your story with debate? How did you get into debate? Because I think it's quite different from a lot of other people that I've had on this channel.
Yeah, so very technically, I technically started debate in middle school, by which I mean I did a debate tournament with 3 rounds once in middle school. Uh, funnily enough, that was maybe the fastest I've ever spoken in a debate round somehow. Like eighth grade me was approximating spreading, and I have never come quite close to that level of speed ever since. But I got much more seriously into debate in high school. So I did a weird variant of what most people would consider American Parley in most of my high school career. I dabbled like a bit in other formats. So I did a bit of Wesley, which is the same structure as like American Parley, but with some elements of progressive debate added into the mix. Like every so often, you'll get like a theory shell thrown in, you'll get some critical arguments. It's kind of like a slight mix of lay APTA and or American Parley and more technical Parley. I did a bit of British parliamentary. We were always like the token Americans that would drive up to these Canadian tournaments, and then we would just be like the token school that the Canadians would then cite for the reason their tournament was, quote, international, unquote, by which I mean there were 30 Canadian schools and one random American team that drove 4 hours to Montreal. And I dabbled in like miscellaneous other weird Connecticut styles. Connecticut decided that it was too cool for all of the other formats, so it created this weird hybridized version that involved some cross-ex, kind of prep ahead, kind of extemporaneous, and threw it all in together and called it debate. But it was a lot of fun. So that's like the formats I did, but my actual investment in debate didn't really pick up significantly until COVID. So COVID was interesting for the obvious reason that everything went online. And when everything went online, it basically made it possible, even though the Connecticut circuit slash the Parley circuit on the eastern coast of the United States pre-COVID was fairly underdeveloped, by which I mean you would have like a small number of tournaments every now and then. You would go and you would compete against the same old faces and debate roughly similar topics. Suddenly, everything went online, so things really exploded and quite took off. So that's when I got much more seriously invested in debate. So almost all of my serious debating has basically been April 2020 onwards. And by serious debating, what I mean is like this is when I started to very much like kind of eat, sleep, breathe debate, so to speak. Like this would be the sort of thing where prior to this, pandemic era debating, I might periodically go to a tournament or maybe periodically would read the news. And then post online is when I started to become much more obsessive about reading the news and prepping motions and doing random practice rounds at ungodly hours of the night, stuff like that. So that was how I got most invested into debate. It's obviously a little weird to credit the pandemic for like becoming a major transformative point in your debate career, but I think enough people have probably had some variant of that that it's probably not just unique to me. So I uh, did a lot of debate my senior year of high school. I had a streak going where, with the exception of Christmas and New Year's, I debated, I think, every weekend between
Yeah.
roughly mid-October and roughly mid-April. Like I would just like a massive streak. Admittedly, I've never like topped that. I don't think anyone ever could or ever should. It's probably not wise to do that much debate. But that was like my kind of high school career. A lot of extemporaneous style parley. I took a gap year after senior year of high school, and that's when I started getting into, if you're not from or if you're not from BP or World Schools or APTA, the term matter file might be a little bit foreign, although I think Helen mentioned it a bit in her interview. Matter filing is basically like the kind of simple way of describing it is like Wikipedia, but for debaters, where you just make your own kind of long list of random factoids and interesting things that can be useful in debate. Different people differ on exact meanings of the term. I have no idea why people get so territorial about their particular definition of the term. It doesn't seem that important to me. But that's when I started getting much more seriously into what I would sort of call like an empirics-driven approach to extemporaneous debate. So I'm sure we'll talk about this more later, but the way I got much more invested in debate was somewhat unusual in the sense that when most people get very invested in debate, they get very invested probably more so in the skill dimension of it, i.e., doing lots of practice rounds or doing lots of drills or doing lots of tournaments and very closely listening through their rounds and thinking about all of that. I certainly did some of this, but basically 2021 onwards, the vast majority of my debate prep consisted of non-debate related things that were just useful for debate. So like learning economic theory or reading about a bunch of miscellaneous IR things that I had no idea about prior to 2021 and just building up a knowledge base and then reverse engineering debate arguments and strategies, et cetera, from that. So that's kind of like how I got into debate, so to speak, and like where I eventually segued into university. I did also kind of illegally start doing university debating prior to actually entering university. So like March of my senior year, I did like two, I think, APTA tournaments, kind of like they were legal, they were sanctioned by APTA, but it is technically called college debate for a reason, i.e., it is theoretically for college students. But that was my like first intro to college debate. I continued that through college. I've done two formats, one of them APTA, which is slightly more technical, although I'm sure if you come from a properly technical background, you would kind of laugh at the idea that APTA is a highly technical format. And then the other is British Parley, which is a relatively more lay style. It has the oddity of having four teams as opposed to two. Everyone's reaction that I've ever spoken to about this who doesn't know BP is always like, what? How? But it actually works, and it is actually quite a lot of fun. And so that's mostly how I ended up getting into debate vis-a-vis college.
Well, okay, there's so much there to unpack, but that is a what a cool story of how you got into debate. I guess for starters, I agree. I think APTA is a bit more technical. I think it's more technical even than some people think from like these other what you call like properly technical formats. Like I don't know. I've had the same experience where some people, they hear that Parley is technical and they're like, oh yeah, and they roll their eyes. But there are some like I think even maybe debating against some people like you debated Andrew and Perry a fair amount of times, right?
True.
And
Oh,
you would
yes, yes,
know.
absolutely. Yeah, they certainly embraced the more technical side of the league and did it masterfully, I might add. They were excellent.
Right. I will talk with you a bunch about matter files later, but maybe this is one of your answers to my next question, which is like you've done a lot of debate. You said that you sort of exploded in doing debate in COVID. I wonder, is there like a moment or a period of time for you where things sort of clicked, where you got a lot better very quickly? And what do you think made the difference with that?
So I think there were probably two-ish points where I had sort of quote unquote click moments. So the first was probably my second semester of senior year doing Parley. I honestly have no clue why things started clicking for me. Like I have attempted to answer this question like very many times, but there was something that changed for me like first semester senior year. And I don't know, maybe it was like the senioritis makes you a way better debater, but it was something about the shift from first to second semester senior year that significantly improved the quality of my debating. My personal theory for this, the best theory I have for why things started clicking for me more is I took a break in between, well, a short break, admittedly, but a break nonetheless in doing debate pretty religiously for like probably a month-ish or so in roughly December-ish, probably. And I actually did much better after that. So this is like the first time that it's not even just like competitive success. It's more like being in rounds where you're listening to arguments and you just have an instinctive understanding of like, aha, here's how the round's going to play out. We'll say this, they'll say that. Here's how we preempt that in first speech. Here's the correct argument to go for in rebuttal. Here's the right collapse. Here's the thing that the judge probably doesn't think is winning from us. Here's what is. Here's what we should blow up on. Here's what we should drop, etc. Like that's when things just started clicking much more at the sort of strategic meta level, if you will, for me. I've always partially attributed this as best I can to, I actually do think that sometimes, as counterintuitive as it is, like taking time away from debate can actually be quite good for understanding how debates play out more. I think part of the reason for this is like one of the risks with doing a ton of debate very frequently is you kind of get immersed in like the debate echo chamber and things just start making sense to you that don't make sense to people who are not similarly obsessed with all of the arguments that you're thinking through and working through, et cetera. So I've also had this experience somewhat in APTA where if you run it for context, APTA, you like run your own cases, you get to set the topic. And one of the risks with that is like you can, in theory, very tightly optimize every single sentence and every single argument you ever make. But I actually think that there is a risk of over optimizing, for example, in APTO, where you write a case and you engineer every sentence to be so beautiful that you think it's perfect, except it's actually so over perfect that judges are like, I don't understand what you were going for here or how these arguments fit together. So my first click moment, so to speak, was roughly entering second semester of senior year. I think part of it is like taking time away counterintuitively is kind of useful. The second moment that clicked a bit more for me probably was entering my second year of university debating, so entering my sophomore year. I think part of this is that this is when I started getting significantly more interested in sort of exploring concepts deeply as opposed to just exploring a bunch of concepts somewhat broadly.
Mhm.
So my kind of view is like, there's two approaches that you can have to like learning about the world. One of them is kind of the like chat GPT approach by which or like the Jeopardy approach maybe is the better way to call it, by which I mean like you learn a bunch of miscellaneous kind of like intro level course 101 type facts about a bunch of things. Like this is the person who's leading the Chinese government. Here is what the law of demand says. Here are the basic arguments that are made by second wave feminists, that type of stuff. And this is, of course, very useful for, I would actually guess, all debate formats. Like, unless there is a debate format that is actively anti fact. And as much as people like to complain about APTA or any other format, I actually don't think that most debate formats are like fundamentally anti truth, much as people might like to disagree with that. And to that extent, just like knowing a bunch of kind of broad stuff is useful. I switched more towards exploring a smaller number of things in greater depth entering my second year of university. This is independent of university studies, I should clarify. I think learning things at university is very cool. You should go to your classes and do your homework. But I also think that there's just a lot of fun stuff that you can learn outside of the context of formal courses and assignments and professors, which is probably where the vast majority of my learning has occurred, at least for the purposes of debate. And I think one of the things that helped make things click much more for me was just taking relatively specific subjects and just learning quite a lot about them. So for example, I spent like a week learning about like the pharmaceutical industry, like what are the major companies involved? Why are they doing the things that they're doing? How are they regulated? How does patent law work, et cetera? And I think one of the things that like made this useful for me is not that I would get a topic on that and be like, oh my God, this is amazing. Obviously that helps. Like if you've really extensively prepped a topic and then you get it, it's great. And I guess this is kind of the whole logic of public forum to an extent. If you just prep things really well, odds are you'll do better in the round. But I also think that there's like kind of a series of just like externalities that come from like learning about one thing really deeply that apply to arguments that have literally nothing to do with that particular subject. Like if you can explain in really, really good depth, here is why, like, I don't know, Project Warp Speed facilitated the development of the COVID vaccine and can explain, like, very thoroughly, here are why incentives changed in specific ways. Here's how science differed pre and post Operation Warp Speed. Like, if you can explain a very compelling story, it has a lot of interesting utility in explaining a whole range of other arguments that have literally nothing to do with pharmaceuticals. Like if you're explaining how companies react to tariffs, there's suddenly a lot of shared analysis or insights. If you're explaining how social movements persuade people to change their behavior, lots of applications there. So I think that there's the reason that I clicked heading into my second year of university. For reference, I'm now in third, so this is my junior year, but like that this was last year. The moment
Wait,
that I clicked
you're
a
a
lot for
junior?
yeah, yeah, yeah. So I'm a
I
third
could
year
have
now.
sworn you were a senior. You still have another year of this.
Alas, I do. Alas, I do. One more ahead of me. Yeah.
That's crazy. Wait,
Yeah.
what?
So, but like that was like the moment that like probably things started clicking a bit more in the sense of like, and just like being able to understand at a relatively intuitive level advanced concepts that apply to a pretty deep range of topics. So those are probably the two moments where like things started clicking, so to speak.
Yeah, that makes sense. So to summarize, taking some time off to sort of ruminate a little bit, and then
Yes.
also thinking about things more deeply instead of just learning all of the headlines, for example.
Yes, exactly.
I have a question about that second one. I guess we could like start talking about matter files-ish now. We can dip our toes in.
Yeah.
How, like, what is your process for learning, either broadly or deeply? Like, do you just go on Google? What are the websites that you find most helpful, etc.?
Yeah, so this is probably the question that people have asked me like by far the most. People are very interested in my like approach to research, and I guess this is probably useful for public forum. So the sort of joke that I have with admittedly just myself and ChatGPT, because these are the only people I think who find this joke funny, is like if there's three words that could best summarize me, they would be the second tab. And what I mean by the second tab is whenever I'm matter filing or researching, I always have two tabs open on Google Chrome always. The first tab is the doc I'm working on, like whatever I'm editing. And the second tab is like whatever link or document or website or whatever it is that I'm working off. And all of the other tabs are just a bunch of hyperlinks or things that were referenced in the second tab doc that I think are interesting or could be worth exploring. So this is a very abstract description of this, but like I'll have a doc, I'll have a source. I'll start with it could be anything. It could be a Wikipedia article. It could be what ChatGPT has to say about something. It could be a New York Times article. It could be some random Substack. I will say, random plug, blogs and Substacks are chronically underrated, I think, and not for cards purposes. Like you probably shouldn't be citing some random dude's like blog as evidence for why nuclear war will happen because of the removal of corn subsidies or whatnot. But they actually are pretty useful as like a starting point for just finding people who have strong opinions and then seeing the arguments they make and then following up on those arguments. So anyways, I'll typically take a source and I'll go through it and I'll try to understand or pull out or dissect whatever I can from it. And then basically anything in that that I don't understand, a word I don't get, a concept I'm unfamiliar with, an argument that sounds interesting but doesn't intuitively make sense to me, whatever, I'll then open a new tab, and then suddenly that will become its own kind of mini side quest of sorts. The consequence of doing all of this is two things. The first is that your computer hates you because you end up with like actually an unhealthy number of Chrome tabs. The second consequence is you don't need to retain everything. Like what I think is a common misconception in extemporaneous formats is that the purpose of matter filing or learning about the world is to become really good at a trivia show. Like you should be able to recite back all facts you have learned as if you're James Holzhauer winning a game of Jeopardy. I think the better way to think about it is like you're trying to better understand a narrative story about how the world works, and facts help guide you towards that narrative understanding. Like there's a bunch of things I have written about. I have written entire Google Docs about probably entire countries that if you quizzed me on it, I would get like 0 out of 15. And you would be like, you wrote this, Ryan. Why don't you remember this? And the short answer is like, I just wouldn't remember it. Like, I don't know. I wrote it 2 years ago. But I think the process of taking a source or a few sources and just going through and understanding the narrative that's being told here, whether it's about economic incentives or social bias or whatever it happens to be, and just understanding it very deeply. And anything you don't understand deeply, following up on that until you do understand it at an intuitive level is kind of the way I personally approach things. That's obviously a little bit abstract, but that's kind of my like general methodology for how I approach research slash thinking about questions. And this probably also applies to some extent to actually evidence-based formats like public forum too.
Right. But I agree with you. I feel like it seems like it's smart to view all of this research as sort of building narratives. I feel like
Yeah,
the storytelling in debate is so important. It's kind of a
I
lost
agree.
art in advanced PF these days. So bring that back, you know?
Yeah, I agree with this. Yeah.
The next question I have is like, you've told us now a lot about what you do with the sources when you have them. How do you go about finding the sources that you get the most from in the first place?
Yeah, so it probably depends a slight bit on topic area. So, like for example, if there is a current eventsy type thing that you want to learn a bit more about, there are typically like general sources that are useful. Admittedly, like I have no useful new information on this one. Like obviously, I think the New York Times is great. I think that The Economist is great. I think that Al Jazeera is great. Like kind of all of the classics are good for just like your bread and butter stuff. I think what's often useful though is two things. So the first thing I'll say, and this is a slight hot take, and it's definitely time inefficient, but I'm a huge believer in this. I actually am a really big believer in reading like primary sources to learn about things. So what I mean by that is like I don't know, I'll just take the nuclear energy topic, for example. Like, there's a lot of interesting writings. I guess I'll fudge a little bit and talk about nuclear weapons, which is quasi-related, but technically distinct. Like, there are just a lot of interesting documents that you can read, like from the era in which nuclear weapons were being developed, doctrines were being devised, etc. Like, you can read MSC 68, which is sort of the defining treatise on US national security policy and nuclear doctrine during the Cold War. It is declassified. You can Google it. There's a weird, you know, that like old school document thing where like the typeset is like really weird and it looks like it's a spy document because it is. Like, you can actually go and read that stuff. And I think there's a lot of value in that. It's admittedly not very time efficient for the purpose of improving at debate, by which I mean like I don't know, going back and reading like declassified government documents from 40 years ago is a very hard thing to like causally make you win another round at next weekend's tournament. But it's the sort of thing that just makes you genuinely more interested in whatever it is that you're learning, which I actually think matters a lot. Like the difference between 2 and 3 hours of research can be pretty meaningful. And if the thing that makes you sufficiently invested, kind of like endogenously, organically in spending the additional hour researching is like, wow, this is interesting. I want to learn more. If the thing that gets you there is reading something that was actually written during a particularly interesting historical moment, I think it's quite cool to do that. The second thought I have on like sources more broadly is I think in general, people are too scared to read opinionated sources. So what I mean by this is like you can get a lot out of reading your kind of generic like Wikipedia articles or ChatGPT entries. Like I actually think that there's nothing wrong with going on Wikipedia or putting a query into ChatGPT and being like, explain this concept to me. How is this war playing out, whatever it happens to be. But I actually think that sometimes, especially for debate, like the facts that are most relevant are the facts that are at least somewhat contested, not at the empirics level of like this person is alive and was born on this date, but more like facts that different people interpret somewhat differently. So like I'll just give a kind of simple-ish example of this. Like if you're reading about the Russia-Ukraine war, it probably actually can be useful to like read speeches by Zelensky and see what his conception of the world is, and read sources that are not just the New York Times, for example, like describing the movement of soldiers on the battlefield, and getting a sense of like how people with strong the subject feel about things. There are like other examples of this that come to mind, like academic journal articles can be actually quite good at this sometimes. Like, for example, if you read a lot of political science papers or even philosophy papers, like it's not just like a long list of facts and it's like, here is the GDP of this country, but you can also get some pretty interesting takes on like, here is why this country's macroeconomic policy is horrible and needs to change. Likewise, I think that opinion sections can sometimes be kind of interesting for this. Like reading like opinion articles on like the Wall Street Journal can give you like a kind of interesting view on like center right arguments, for example, on trade policy. And sometimes like pursuing controversial pieces can actually be quite useful. And obviously by this, I don't mean like you have to like go read like actually evil people's writings and be like, let me run the fascist argument on this topic. But like reading things that you disagree with and thinking about why you disagree with them, I think is a very useful exercise in improving your knowledge base, and challenging the narratives that you've constructed to explain why the world looks the way it does.
Okay, I have one more question, and then I want to talk a little bit about something else. So, first question is, it seems like I think we actually prep in very different ways. Like I'm recalling the way that I've prepped for public forum in the past. And I think maybe the difference is when people prep for public forum, they sort of use every source as like a chess piece, like its own argument that can help them in the debate. It's very instrumental, if that makes sense. Like, and it's probably
Yep.
instrumental in either way, but in a slightly different way, I think. Like, maybe this is a problem with our approach, is that every single time I like look at a website, even in an opinion article or something, I'm just looking for it to say what I want it to say. And then like
Mm.
if it does, I copy that part, I put it in my argument, and then bada bing, bada boom, I have a case. But I'm usually not really looking out of curiosity. You know, I'm not really looking to like learn about how the world works. I'm looking to see like how can I describe the world in this way and then find evidence afterwards. I think the unfortunate thing about maybe one, the internet, and two, the sort of the norms of public forum and the low threshold of what it takes to call something evidence, is that you can viably in public forum debate sort of construct your argument first, and then find all of the evidence that agrees with the argument afterwards, rather than what seems to be your approach of like starting with learning what is true and then constructing the narrative and the argument from there. And I wonder if this is like a strategic thing, like if this is something different about the structure of public forum that incentivizes this. And I wonder how your approach would be different if you were in public forum. Like, I guess the biggest difference, right, is that we don't have a different topic every round. We have like a topic
Yeah.
for like a month or 2 months. We go incredibly in depth on that topic, and then we move to a different one. How would your research be different if you were in an environment like that?
So I've actually thought about this pretty explicitly, in part because like I'm not particularly deeply religious, but if I were religious and if I believed that God puts people on this earth for something, I'm pretty sure I was put on this earth to do an evidence-based format. Like my approach to debate is significantly more aligned with like policy, for example, than parley. Just in the sense that like the part of debate I do by far the most is like reading articles and then writing long form notes about them, which is probably a bit less aligned with extemporaneous formats. But so I guess my view is this. I think that they're consistent. You can do both and there's value in both. So the obvious difference that I think is most important in research between an extemporaneous format and a format where you have a topic for some set period in time is if you are prepping for an extemporaneous format, the tournament, excuse me. I combined tournament and format. That's an interesting word. If you're prepping for an extemporaneous topic of some kind, you know inevitably one that you won't be able to cite any specific like hyper specific source. Like you can't, for example, in an extemporaneous source stand up and say like, well, this 2018 article in the New York Times says X, therefore X is true. They drop this, therefore X holds to the round, weighing, et cetera, et cetera. And the implication of not being able to cite specific evidence is that constructing relatively persuasive stories from specific pieces of evidence is more important. And what I mean by that is like, it's not as useful to say, here are these three facts and why they win the round. In the way that you might, for example, in a sort of card-based style, be able to say, they drop this specific piece of evidence, which has these implications for the debate, which therefore wins the round. What matters more is like taking evidence and building some narrative or some storyline out of it. I really keep harping on the story part because I actually do think it's a useful way to think about rounds in the sense of like concocting explanations for why companies behave the way they do, people react the way they do, parties campaign the way they do. Like thinking of these different like parts of the world as like characters in a story, I actually think is a pretty useful mindset to have. So I suppose what I'm trying to say is this: if your aim is to construct like a broad set of arguments that don't rely on hyper-specific evidence, the best approach, at least in my view, is to sort of start with specific pieces of evidence and sort of from that broaden out and develop more cohesive explanations of incentives, capacities, etc. This is all very abstract. I'll give one example and then do the flip side of like my views on card-based formats or PF specifically. Like for example, if you are, let me think of the best example. I don't know, like one example that comes to mind is like there's a lot of debates in academia about like economic development. How do you best make poor countries rich? How do you best reduce poverty, et cetera? And you could memorize like a bunch of specific case studies and be like, here is South Korea's experience with stabilization. Here are the specific export-oriented industrialization policies they implemented. And here are the specific consequences of that. There's use in that. Like that can win you debates, like just being like, here is the specific information about South Korea. That might win you a debate, even in an extemporaneous format. But what's much more useful than just being able to say, here are the specific details of what like the South Korean like dictatorial regime did to promote growth is like explaining a more holistic story of how you change the incentives of producers to align with the aim of reducing poverty in developing countries and shifting wealth from the sort of core center of the global economy, i.e., developed Western advanced economies, towards, for example, the manufacturing sectors in low income countries. And so, if your aim is to win an extemporaneous debate about development policy, having a good understanding of like extrapolating from specific cases to general theories is useful. For very card-based formats or evidence-based formats, I fully get like your point, which is like there is a lot of value in saying, here is an impact I want to get. Like I want to link, for example, into like proliferation, or I want to link into climate change or extinction or animal rights violations, whatever. Like, can I find a source that says that? I suppose that one of the things that might be interesting, and I'm sure some public forumers, is that a thing? Do people say that? I guess people say PFers, but
Yeah,
do people say
PFR.
I don't know. Anyways, like I've heard PFers used before, but I don't know if I've ever heard public forum. Anyways, that's a random side note. Um, I suppose that there is value in doing both, by which I mean like there will always be value just sort of intuitively in like being like, here's a topic, I want to make an argument that gets this impact. Here are a few cards or a few pieces of evidence or a few like warrants that lead to this outcome. But I do think for whatever it's worth, it might be interesting. Like the way I would personally approach this is like the first week of how I would research for PF would probably just be the way I research for extemporaneous Parley or BP formats, i.e., spend a week just like writing a general set of notes that are not like this author from this year, from this place says this will happen if we do the motion or the resolution, but more like here is general context on how we got here. Here is why we rely on fossil fuels to this extent. Here is why countries are reluctant to use nuclear energy. Here is the future of nuclear energy, like kind of macroscopically, just painting, like not even like a sided characterization, like almost writing notes or thinking about the topic as if you weren't AF or neg or pro or con or gov or op, and just thinking about this from like, I don't know, like you're some random bored person who wants to learn about nuclear energy. What things are out there that might help you do that? Like, I think starting with that can be interesting because it helps shape more macroscopic understanding of whatever the topic is discussing or how it might affect the world. And then from there, being able to get much more specific arguments, links, impacts, etc. I also think, for what it's worth, that this can also be useful in better better figuring out which specific impacts to go for, or having a much clearer picture of this. Like, obviously, there is different formats differ on like the extent to which you can win on quote unquote unreasonable impacts. And I
Mhm.
don't mean unreasonable in the sense, I don't mean unreasonable in like a pejorative sense. Like that's such an unreasonable argument. I mean it in the more literal sense of like there are some arguments that are obviously true. Like they're just factual statements about the world that you cannot contest. And there are other arguments that require 8 different links to be true. And maybe at the end of those 8 links, you get an impact. And I think part of what helps differentiate, especially if you're just being introduced to a topic for the first time, what helps you figure out the distinction between a reasonable and unreasonable argument is having the general macroscopic picture in mind. And it sometimes can be counterintuitive. Like it's not always aligned with what you necessarily think. Like, for example, I mean, just as like one illustration of this, I would guess lots of people, not all people, but certainly a decent number of people probably come into the nuclear energy topic. And like a lot of people see the word nuclear. And I presume their first reaction is like, so this is mostly a debate about like nuclear war and like proliferation, etc. And obviously that is a part of the debate. It would be kind of crazy to deny that. And I have some weird contrived arguments on that we can discuss later.
Nice.
But like it's probably not like the only reasonable way to view the round, or even the most reasonable way to view the round. And so like if you do, 5 minutes of reading and you just even like ask ChatGPT, like what are the main arguments for, like, even just simple stuff like that, you probably get a different sense of like, oh, probably the most reasonable stuff is this. And obviously reasonable doesn't mean winning. There can be unreasonable arguments that are very, very winning, and there can be reasonable arguments that are totally and completely losing. But I suppose what helps is if you have a good macroscopic view of the round or of the topic more broadly, it makes it a bit easier to figure out what are the most substantial arguments that are actually quite reasonable, but I would otherwise have disregarded as not being a particularly reasonable or particularly sensible argument. So I'll give one example of this, which is a little bit of a weird one, but like I think a lot of people, when you look at the nuclear energy motion, the argument about nuclear terrorism seems far-fetched initially. So the argument is basically some terrorist group will seize sort of like radioactive waste, they'll attach it to a conventional bomb and they'll blow it up in a mall, and you've got a dirty bomb, and huzzah. And like this argument, I think to a lot of people, myself 2 years ago probably would have been like, this seems crazy and very far-fetched. But like
Right.
if you actually read like a decent bit of like security, like this is like a lot of people probably wouldn't say this in like the national security establishment, but like this has been arguably one of the largest fears in like the US national security realm in like the last 75 years. Like the possibility of like a rogue terrorist or white nationalist militia seizing some spent radioactive waste or stealing it off a truck and attaching it to a simple like pressure cooker bomb and blowing it up. So like this keeps like thousands of people up at night. Like there are entire like departments in the Department of Homeland Security that think about this question. And so if you start macroscopic, even if you're researching something unrelated to nuclear energy policy, like, I don't know, like not counter-terrorist policy or
Right.
whatever, like it can give you an interesting view on like what is reasonable and what is
Yeah.
not. And I think that sometimes the most hidden gem arguments are like arguments that you initially thought are totally unreasonable, but actually turns out are like very, very real, and if blown up properly, can just be absolutely devastating.
Wow. I feel like it's a very good point that has changed my perspective already. It's funny that you should mention specifically nuclear terrorism because just like yesterday, I debated actually against a team of mine that I'm coaching from Plano West, and they were reading an argument on the neg about nuclear terrorism, and I just made fun of it. And so, like, it's funny that you specifically mentioned that because I think the first argument that popped in my head when you said unreasonable arguments was like nuclear terrorism. And so, yeah, I think this is a good point. Like, if you actually do some research, then some of these unreasonable arguments, they suddenly, seems like they actually do have legs and they are maybe a little bit more backed in the literature than you might have originally assumed. Okay, that's a great point. Last thing on all of this, I need you to explain yourself real quick. What the hell is this? What is this?
Ah, yes, the real gem. So this was so I've produced three matter files at this point. So the second and third of them are fully publicly released. Vietnam is the second, Panama is the third. The Vietnam file is a bit more like dense than the Panama file. The first one is the one that I wrote during my gap year. It is actually the longest of all of the three matter files. It is also
Really?
the least useful, and looking back, it has some extremely cringe arguments. It was roughly when I was trying to get into like learning about econ and finance. And so the way I would do it is I would like take a topic. I would be like, we should ban this financial regulation, and I would write a case on it. And I looked back at these cases like a year, maybe 6 months ago, and I was like, oh God, this is really incorrect. Not like a oh, I'm so much better now. Like, there are better arguments. I just mean like, no, like this is basic Econ 101 wrongs type stuff. But anyways, so this is my matter file. So the short version of like what the matter file is it's basically two things. It's a collection of arguments that show up a lot, which is the stock argument section, which is probably the most popular part of it. I have
Right.
no real way of gouging it, but that's the kind of first like 100 something pages. I guess first 102. I was pretty close. And this is a bunch of like miscellaneous stuff that's like, I don't know, here are arguments for why we should privatize state-owned companies. Here are arguments for why taking out the leaders of terrorist groups is good. Here are arguments for why the court system should not prioritize long prison sentences, stuff like that. This is mostly, for me, it's intended to be a shorthand way of remembering arguments so I don't forget them and be stupid in rounds. Sometimes it's a little easy to use a technical term that I don't like to use much, to get lost in the sauce, as the kids like to say. Like it's very easy to get so lost in complex weirdness that you forget very simple arguments. So the reason I originally created this long list of stock arguments was mostly for me to just remember to not say obvious things. And you'd be shocked, even like really great debaters, like myself included, will just sometimes miss painfully obvious arguments. Even like the nationalization privatization debate, for example, which is the very first part of that. Like a huge argument that's very often made in favor of privatization in like the real world is like if we privatize companies, the government just immediately gets money because someone's going to buy out the company and we're going to get money, and that's great. And it's shocking how many debates you could have about privatization or nationalization that even like god tier debaters would forget like the most simple argument probably for privatization, which is like money good and we get money. Anyway, so that's like the first part of this, which is like a bunch of miscellaneous stock arguments. There are missing ones. There are parts that I would probably go back in retrospect and revise, but it's a long list of that. The next, I don't know, 400-ish pages are a series of kind of miscellaneous notes that's more IR focused. There's lots of there's a decent bit of it that's not IR specific. Like for example, there are like the notes on pharmaceutical development that I mentioned earlier. There's a series of notes on like miscellaneous things about um, racism in the police force and like injustices against women in developing countries and education. So there's like a whole bunch of like miscellaneous stuff in there as well. That's not necessarily international relations oriented, but probably like a decent-ish chunk of it. Oh yeah, there are some really random things in here. I forgot. I did like a piece on Jesus and Muhammad. I just
Yeah.
did like here was Muhammad's life, here was Jesus's life. Here's what they did. Like here's a one-page biography for you. Some
What
of these are really useless.
Yeah, I was gonna ask like
No,
what
sorry, go ahead.
emotions were you expecting for that this might
So
be?
interestingly, the Muhammad motion actually, the Muhammad matter file notes have actually been kind of interesting. I've periodically used them, I guess the Jesus ones too, to make some very contrived like theology arguments and like debates about like what religions ought or should do, and be like, well, Jesus did this thing, which tells us this about this religion's interests or whatnot. And obviously, this is a bit of fake theology. And if I was being judged by like an actual priest or imam, they would probably be like, "Well, that's not how theology works." But you can glean some knowledge from understanding like key figures in religious history. There are some parts of this that are like a little bit less useful and like less helpful. Like for example, there is somewhere in here, there's a section called like emotions, and I just spend like a half a page like defining what an emotion is in the most needlessly psychologically jargony way possible. And I cannot imagine in any circumstance why you would, as a debater, need to stand up and be like, Judge, there is this foreign thing called an emotion. You have probably never heard of it because you are obviously a robot. Let me give you like the 7-step psychological official trademark definition of emotions. But like large parts of it are just like kind of miscellaneous facts about, I don't know, like European football leagues here, for example, that are kind of vaguely useful in debate. This is kind of what I mentioned it like way back at the beginning, which is a lot of people that I've spoken with about this think that the purpose of this document is to have a miscellany is either one to like it's like my study guide for Jeopardy, like just like here's how to make lots of money off Jeopardy, which sadly it is probably not. You need to do a lot more history and pop culture to win Jeopardy. But the second thing that people think that this document is intended to be is like a bunch of miscellaneous facts to then like throw at people in debate, like I don't know. It's like there's probably like have probably seen it. Like there's a fairly famous like meme-ified clip from PF a few years back where Sam Arneson, who was just a fantastic PFer and then went on to be a fantastic BP and APTA debater, has this like roast line in Cross where I forget whether it was
It's
Will
like
or
the
Sam
First
actually.
Amendment thing, right? It was
Yeah,
like
it's like the First Amendment one where it's like in Cross, he gets asked like, like, can you name like the section of the First Amendment that does this thing? And it's like, yes, I can. It's the First Amendment. And everyone's like, oh my God, roasted. And I think some people assume that having a long list of miscellaneous facts is like intended to be that. Like someone says something stupid and then you say, actually, no, you don't know the GDP of Liechtenstein. Let me get you right back and make you look really stupid. And I actually think that that's a bad way to think about matter filing and like the collection of facts. I think the much better way to think about it is that in most debates at some point in time become repetitive. I don't mean this in like a bad way, like people are setting these really boring, repetitive, monotonous topics. What I more so mean is that there are a limited number of things that in the like you can disagree about, and these have a tendency to replicate across subject areas. So, for example, debates about financial regulation are often really just debates that effectively boil down to should we try to make the economy less risky, like reduce the likelihood of having a 2008 style crash, or should we try to make the economy grow as much as possible and reduce poverty to the greatest extent, even if we take a risk that there is, say, a slightly higher probability of financial crisis? This, in many ways, is at the sort of weighing level, not all that different than, say, IR debates, where there's some debate about reducing the risk of conflict, but also perhaps reducing some other miscellaneous benefit, cooperation between countries, action on climate change, whatever it happens to be. And so those two debates probably look very different, like a debate about IR and reducing the likelihood of saber rattling diplomacy, and a debate about financial regulation and derivatives. But in many ways, they're actually similar. It's a weighing question of like, should we prioritize risk aversion or maximization of absolute benefit? And I think the benefit of having just a bunch of miscellaneous facts stored somewhere in your brain is that there are sort of similarities between debates, such that knowing about one debate or knowing about facts for one debate often end up being pretty useful or helpful in other debates. So even just like on the ones like listed here, for example, like there's notes on Israel's judicial reforms, which were all the rage in sort of like the pre-October 7 sort of Israeli politics discussion. Netanyahu had proposed a series of reforms that would functionally gut Israel's Supreme Court. There were mass protests against it. And like that's the sort of thing where like if you get a motion about Israeli judicial reform, great, you're probably set. But there's also a lot of use if you get any motion, for example, about like democratic backsliding, or if you have any debate about court policy or court reform, or even any debate more broadly about like democratic rights and what is legitimate to expect of a government, or what issues should or should not be managed or adjudicated by technocrats. So there's a lot of synergies across topics, and that's kind of the purpose of the matter file. If that's like that's a very
Yeah,
grand explanation of
that
it, but
makes
hopefully
sense.
that makes sense.
I feel like a good example of this. I was showing some of my students in Taiwan some of your speeches recently, the Sudan speech specifically
Ah, yes.
in World Semis this year. And I think you used an example in that one about Kenya had promised some amount of peacekeepers to I think it was it Cuba or
The Haiti is what they, yeah.
yeah, to Haiti, and then didn't follow through. And this was like, the topic was about Sudan peacekeeping. This is like sort of completely different, but at the same time related. And so I think it goes to show like you can use disparate, seemingly disparate facts from all sorts of different learning that you've done to construct the story that you want to tell through examples on the topic that you are debating. Like debating nuclear energy, we will use analogies, we will use examples, we will use stories from like all over different topic areas that I think will all synergize with the same topic that we are debating right now. So yeah, very good point. And if this isn't crazy enough, like you said, you made three of these. I am shocked that the first one is the longest. From what I recall, the Panama matter file that you just released, I mean, recently, is even longer than the Vietnam one. And so the one that you made in your gap year is even longer than both. How many pages, what is your word count in matter files at this point?
That's a good question. I should sum it up. All I know is so the reason I know that the first one is longer than the second or third is because by the second and third I mean the Vietnam and Panama ones is on the first matter file I ever wrote. I didn't know this existed, but I hit the character count for Google Docs. Like Google Docs will not let you exceed. It comes out to roughly like somewhere in the ballpark of like 700 pages roughly. And like after that, Google Docs will just not let you edit it. It's a really weird experience actually because
That's
like you
great.
refresh the dock like 8 times because you just think that like, I don't know, your computer's being slow. And then eventually you like Google it and it's like Google is like actually sorry, bud, you are not allowed to write anymore. And then you have to set up a different Google Doc. So eventually that's the reason I know the first one is longer, but I should probably do a word count and see what the total word count is. It's got to be pretty long at this point.
That is absurd. And like to be clear, this is all like hand typed notes. Like this is not like
Yes, yes. Oh,
that.
this is a miscellaneous plug I actually had intended to mention earlier, but I'll mention it anyways. The only, in my opinion, significant difference between evidence approach in extemporaneous versus evidence-based formats is in evidence-based formats, obviously copy and pasting is essential, like having cards and like doing that. The one rule I have, like I have very few rules when it comes to matter filing. Like I do weird things with indentations and I use italics inconsistently and I use different sources kind of randomly. The one rule I adhere to is unless I'm quoting either like a primary source that is actually useful or I'm quoting something that has just been beautifully written, I'll never copy and paste. The reason why is exclusively that you retain less if you copy and paste. There's obviously a difference in a carded format because you then have to like make a card, like you don't just copy paste something in, you then do all of the cool highlighting stuff that sadly I've never actually done in my debate career, but I've always thought would be very fun to do. It looks very fun anyways.
It's not.
But like I suppose that's maybe a an outsider's take that would not hold up if I actually did this for an extended period in time. But I think that you retain information way better when you're actually forced to rewrite it. So even if you, for example, use ChatGPT and you get the exact answer you're looking for, odds are you will retain information at least 10% better if you just literally verbatim write a similar or identical thing as what ChatGPT told you, rather than just doing the really easy thing of, copy and paste and put it into the doc and move on. Copying and pasting is great if you're looking for just like a cheat sheet that you can reference in rounds. So it probably does have a lot of use then in a format where the topic is known and there's no real uncertainties about exactly what might change. Like you're not going to walk into a public forum round and the judge is going to be like, "Psych, actually, today we will be discussing West Africa." Whereas in a format where it's a little less easy to know in advance what the topic is, you shouldn't really be able to rely as much on just like pulling up a doc and control Fing for specific things. In some cases that can help, but odds are you're better off just like rewriting things as opposed to copy pasting.
That makes a ton of sense. Okay, last few questions about debate in general before we move on to the nuclear energy topic. My next question is literally just like, what are your biggest hot takes? I know you mentioned some earlier, and maybe some of them have to do with this matter file business, but I want to know about the other ones. Like, everyone asks you a million questions about matter files. I want to know about
Fair.
like debate strategy, that's what's interesting to me.
So I'll share two. I'll share a debate strategy take, and then I'll share, I guess it's not really a hot take as much as it is like a weird, very abstract philosophical take I have about debate that has been ruminating for like 5 months. So I'll try to articulate it somewhat.
Nice.
In terms of like actual strategy hot takes, so I'll give one that's relevant to BP slash APTA, and then it's really terrible advice for public forum, like truly horrible advice, which is why I'm caveating it doesn't apply to PF. And then I'll do one that I think actually might apply to PF. So my hot take for BP certainly, and APTA though to a lesser extent, I'll explain why in a moment, is I just think people should listen way more and write a lot less. So the reason I caveat that this certainly doesn't apply to PF and it applies better to BP and less to APTA is like in formats that are more tabula rasa or more like dropped equals true for the round, there is a risk. Like if you just like sit back in your chair and like kind of meditate while thinking about the other side and then forget a sub point, you might be cooked, and that is not a great place to be in. So it is not a wise move, like in more line by line formats to do this. But I think my hot take broadly is that like people actually would benefit a lot. And I mean like a lot. Like I'm advocating for this at like a pretty radical scale. Like I think it should be fine if you're in BP and you're on back half. Like I think it should be fine if you just don't take notes in like the top half. Like you just sit there and you just listen. Like don't write anything, don't scribble anything on your like you literally just sit there and write. And I think the reason why is most debates pretty broadly, even in very technical formats, end up being about persuasion. Like even the most like tech over truth judges out there, I don't think anyone would ever admit this. Like even if you gave them like a truth pill and you were like, tell me your actual reality about how you judge. I don't think anyone would ever be like, yeah, I just vote on vibes for the team that seems more persuasive. Like neg just carried the vibes and therefore I vote neg. Like I actually don't think that any sensible judge, especially not a truly tech judge, would ever admit this. But I do think that, like, given that we are still being judged by humans and we have not yet shifted towards AI judging, like, you are being judged by humans, and humans have cognitive biases and just beliefs about the round as they are unfolding. And in variances, the reason people have those beliefs is because they're seeing things that you would not see if you get overly lost in the weeds. Like, a simple example of this would be people just focusing on the wrong clash when there's a much more winning argument to go for. And it's very easy. I would guess even in public forum, though I have a lot less experience there, to like, if the other team reads like, I don't know, like 5 front lines on something or spends a bunch of time on one part of the debate, it is just very easy to get sucked into that if the only thing that you're doing is like you have your paper and you're like furiously scribbling away.
Yeah,
And
this
then
is
when you get
true.
up to speak, it's very easy to stand up and see 5 things to respond to and then just go there. And so I think like people actually should just spend a lot less time um again with the caveat that this applies much better to BP and way worse to formats where you have an actual tech judge in front of you who will properly punish you for just dropping 90% of arguments. But like even in practice rounds, for example, like I think doing like no notes practice rounds is a great way to just like improve and learn. It's stressful and terrifying the first time you do it. Like, if you're really reliant on notes, spending around just standing up with nothing written down is terrifying. Like it is pretty horrifying to stand up and be like, I do not know what is about to come out of my mouth. But I think that it is really useful for understanding the more holistic, big picture problems that arise in rounds. I think you can also somewhat simulate this to some extent through judging, but I actually think the best way to do it is just to be in rounds where you actually have to give a speech and have to give a speech based almost entirely on your thinking about the round as opposed to getting overly lost in things. I don't think this is like an enormously hot take. I think lots of people would agree that like you shouldn't lose sight of the big picture. Don't forget about arguments that haven't been discussed. Like none of these things are like hot in isolation. But I do think it's the sort of thing that like it's scary to do. Like it is real. Like it's very easy to intellectualize this and say, ah, yes, it is good to think about the big picture, and very, very, very difficult to do it in an actual round in front of an actual judge with consequences on the line. But I do think it's useful, especially in formats where either the judging standards are less technical, e.g., BP, or in formats where like if you have a parent judge who is perhaps a bit less technical than your average like university policy debater, for example, like just not over obsessing on the flow can weirdly be useful. Not as like a this is the correct way to debate thing, but just
Yeah.
like given that persuasion is what wins the game, if you can focus on being persuasive outside of the context of tech, there's a lot
Yeah.
of value, even in technical formats and even in front of technical judges.
Ryan, I'm going to take your hot take and I'm going to turn up the temperature a little bit.
Oh, let's do it. Let's
I
do it.
I completely agree with this. I actually think it is totally applicable in public forum as well.
Oh yeah.
I've been coaching public forum for like 5 years. I think one of the biggest things that I think students can do better is get off of the flow a little bit. Like
Oh yeah.
you really see students get trapped on the flow to some extent, where like there are some rounds where it literally like is kind of absurd. Like there is something really obvious that is a winning like story of the round that no one is putting together because everyone just sees every little card in isolation and not the big picture. And I actually think like it's true in APTA as well. For example, um, in like my senior year, junior year, senior year of APTA, I sort of just stopped taking notes.
I agree with this.
Like I just did. It actually I think it helped me a lot. And there is a difficulty, right? You're right. There's risks. But the last part of this that I think completes the hot take is I think it's fine to drop arguments. I think people are
Oh,
so
I agree.
scared, like so scared, especially in PF of like dropping things. And so PF has just become at this point like a concession game, like who can drop the least and then who can make
Hmm.
the most out of the things the other side dropped. But the problem is like it doesn't have to be that way at all. Like you actually, I think that people have underdeveloped the skill of like winning despite concession, winning despite mistakes. Um,
Yeah.
that skill is probably just called weighing, by the way, which seems to be something that some PFers have forgotten these days. It's interesting. It's like the pendulum is swinging in PF toward, I think that uh, this is a bit of a tangent, but I think like in policy and some other formats of debate, almost every impact is in like pragmatics is sort of like extinction. It's like
Yep.
we're all on the same level playing field because everyone's impact is eventually going to be every single human dies.
Yep.
Or like, or they go the S risk route, and then those are like the two things.
Yeah.
But other than that, like it's sort of nonsensical to compare the impacts. So in policy, that's why they have like magnitude. Maybe they have probability, but not really. They just have defense. I've beaten your argument. And then they have time frame, which I think I was talking with Roy and Ale actually last interview about this. Time frame doesn't really make sense if you're not in
I
policy.
agree with this.
Like it's like why does it matter that one impact comes before the other one? But the reason it makes sense in policy is because they've sort of stripped the format of all of the other weighing that they can do because it's all just extinction. And so of course naturally then whatever you can do to tiebreak makes sense. But I think it's unfortunate that public forum is going down that same road. And so what we see in public forum nowadays is more and more and more rounds at the high technical levels are decided by um, sort of defense and concessions and like who can extend the right argument and less and less by weighing. Um, I think that the answer to this is just like take one step back, look at the bigger picture, agree, yeah, like yes, I concede all of these arguments. Who cares? They
Yep.
are not actually extinction arguments, and even if they are, like mine is a better extinction argument, but not because it like has less ink on it or something, not because it comes first in the time frame, because it like is a better link, because it is a more coherent argument that like it makes more sense and also like it affects a greater scale of the things that would eventually culminate in extinction. And this, I think, is more sophisticated weighing that allows you to just get away with conceding literally everything in the other side. I guess the summary of this hot take is one, I agree with you. I think that debaters of all stripes would benefit from taking fewer notes and thinking more. And two is that I think that you should the highest form of debate is being able to concede everything on the other
Oh,
side,
yes.
including their responses, and still win. And I think if you can do the first one, it will actually help you with the second one, and you will win so many more rounds.
Yeah, a lot. Well, and like I think that this is the sort of thing that like people should like you should prep for this, I think. Like I think that you should find ways, whatever your case you're running, to be like, here are all of the arguments that we actually can outweigh or just
Mhm.
beat. Even if like hypothetically our second speaker stands up and has a small heart attack and forgets to say any words. Like we would be fine even then. Like thinking about this strategically is useful. The same applies to APTA. Like for example, I think the most fun way in APTA for reference, like if you're opping, you don't know the case in advance, and so you're prepping extemporaneously on the spot. I think the most fun way to opt cases is basically just to identify like the one thing that you think is important, and sometimes it can be a little wacky or a little creative, like. For example, making an econ debate like an animal rights debate or whatnot, and then just pick that one thing and then be like, this is the only thing that matters. We'll concede everything else because it matters less, and we'll win this one issue. And if we win the one issue, we win the debate. And if we don't, I guess we don't, but we'll win the one issue. So that's how you'll end up voting. And it's fun because it means that you don't have to win 80 different link level battles about whether this specific politician will win that election or whether you get like this particular economic outcome or any of that. If you just have a coherent explanation for why one argument is just more important than everything else, and being okay with like, I think that so something I used to do, I like consciously force myself to do that I think is useful is like force myself at least 3 times in a speech to be like they are like just say the words they are right, or like just like literally force yourself to at some point in time say they are right on X or they're correct about this particular argument. Part of it is like I think there's persuasive value in doing that. It makes you appear reasonable. Part of it is also there. It just saves you a lot of time as opposed to getting into the weeds if you can just say they're right on this. However, they are wrong that it's more important than this other argument.
Yeah, 100%. 100%. This is like such a good take. You should do this. A good example of this is actually nuclear energy. Like the pro side has very obvious argument about climate change, right? And I think that all of the responses to it, you should just be conceding. Like almost all of them. Like people are going to say climate change is inevitable. Yes, obviously. People will say nuclear energy is not going to completely solve the problem. Yeah, obviously, right? Like if people will even say like empirically, when countries introduce nuclear energy, their emissions still go up. Yes, that's true, but like they go up less than they otherwise would. We don't solve the whole problem. That's impossible, but we solve some of the problem, and that's better than you do, and it is also the biggest impact still. Like I think that is the correct way to debate all of these different arguments, especially like these arguments that are just true, but like for some reason people have such a hard time getting around like some of the basic defense that people just these observations about like how the argument works. I don't know why this is like I don't know. This is something I'll talk about maybe more later, but yeah, it is a frustration of mine that like people are so nitpicky about these things. But they don't really see the bigger picture of the argument and they get too scared of these responses and sort of self-combust. Okay, you said you had a second hot take that you've been ruminating on for a while.
Yeah, so this is less of a strategy take. In fact, it might even be called an anti-strategy take because this is like a take that if you pursued, you would almost certainly win less. Although, I guess okay, I lied. I'll have two philosophical hot takes. The first will be much shorter. The first is like, I actually think that like this is going to sound really weird and also really hypocritical coming from a person who's won a lot. But like, I actually think that you should like, to the extent that you can, you should look forward to is the wrong way to put it, but like I think you should actually, in a weird way, be excited by losses in lots of cases. Like I think that in almost all debate formats, like whether they're hyper technical or hyper lay, like you actually will just learn way more from whatever you lose than the rounds that you win. And it's obviously a really hard thing to internalize. Like I've heard this advice before, and I still probably don't do a great job implementing it. Like it is really hard to walk out of a round that you've lost and be like, hip hip hooray, we lost the round. This is fantastic. But I do think it is just good to like view rounds as the best pieces of like information you'll get about where you need to improve. You learn way less, I think, from losses. Sorry, from wins than you do from losses. That is really hard to agree with, like emotionally. Like, it's kind of like I don't know, it's the gold medalist going over to the bronze medalist and being like, it's okay, you still got a bronze. Like, it's hard, but I think it is true. And like probably the mindset that is most likely to improve your long-term performance. So the second like broader philosophical take is certainly weirder, but I think it's something that like I personally have thought quite a bit about, and I'm going to guess that it's a somewhat widely held opinion amongst many debaters, but it's not like widely shared, not because it's stigmatized, just because it isn't said widely. So I don't have a great way of stating it in short, so I'll try to say it as in short as I can, which basically is I think that one of the biggest like issues with debate, not with any particular format, it's probably universal, is it's very easy in the course of a competitive debate activity to become fairly numb or desensitized to the actual people involved in whatever topic you're discussing. And I actually think that there's a lot of value outside the context of winning and losing and just like reading or engaging with sources that are very either ethnographic or like individual centric. So what I kind of mean by this is like there are many debates that you will end up winning because you identify some group of people or some impact or some type of argument that ends up being round winning and you sort of weaponize it effectively or strategically and you get a good outcome at the end of it. I.e., maybe you, for example, in the nuclear energy debate, make an argument about dumping radioactive waste onto indigenous land. This causes cancers amongst indigenous people. You weigh this argument effectively and it wins you the debate. Great. I think that there's nothing wrong with this. This is how debates work. It's useful to talk about difficult, complicated subjects that involve a wide range of groups. But I do think that there's like the more and more that you do debate, the easier and easier it is to just come to think of arguments or impacts as sort of discrete objects that exist in Google Docs and on like computer flows. And I think one of the things that makes debate a lot more meaningful and like a lot more interesting to do as an activity is to actually think of arguments as like operating in the real world. I don't mean this in the sense of strategic advice, like you should think more about whether your argument is realistic. I mean it much more like emotionally in the sense of like you will probably, at least in my view, get a lot more out of debate if you spend even a small bit of time thinking about like the actual person on the other end of an argument. Like I think that the nuclear waste topic, there are probably 80 different ways that you could take this. For example, I don't know, like read a book, for example, by an indigenous, or like read the intro to a book by an indigenous author, for example, about like the effect of nuclear testing on like indigenous communities in the Arctic. Weirdly cool argument, not cool in like the sense of good, but like it's a weird thing that like is only understood now. This is a total side tangent, by the way, but like interesting research on like nuclear testing is bad because you get a bunch of radioactive dust that concentrates along the poles of the world. My hand signals don't make any sense here, but like this is the world, and like here are the poles. And it's kind of an interesting research, but anyways, that's a side note. And I think you'll just get a lot more out of debate, and like it'll be a much more interesting activity if you think of the arguments you're making as something that you actually care about. Like you don't need to become like deeply invested in every argument that you make. This is almost by definition impossible if you do debate long enough, because you'll debate enough topics about enough issues, about enough groups of people in enough countries and enough contexts that there's no possible way you have the emotional bandwidth to feel
Mhm.
personally connected to each and every impact you make or argument that you discuss. But I do think that debate is a lot more interesting if you think about it as discussing problems that happen in the real world and the best approaches we should take to those problems, as opposed to simply like there are some pieces of evidence that say this thing will happen. Because this thing will happen, we claim this impact, which therefore means that we outweigh their impact on XYZ. I think, in other words, you'll be a lot more invested organically in the activity. At least this is my view. It's like kind of a hot take because enough people disagree with it. But I actually do think that like you will enjoy the activity much more, and as a consequence will do better in the activity if you think about arguments as operating on real people as opposed to just being numbers, basically.
Yeah, I'm surprised that people have disagreed with this. I think this makes total sense. Any little
I
thing.
suppose
Yeah,
I don't want to interrupt you, but I suppose I should actually say the hot take implication of this. Like
sure.
the hot take implication of this, I think, is like I think that people should spend a lot more time reading evidence, not like in speeches per se, but like in prep that is almost certainly useless in the context of actual
Mhm.
rounds, but is just like good to know, like for you. Like let me can I think of like a good example of this? I'll pick like one like kind of example that I suppose works somewhat well for this. I don't think there's been a Syria topic like a Middle Eastern IR topic recently in PF, but like
Yeah.
suppose I guess I don't know, like there was I guess there was one like way back in the pandemic era, if I
Yeah,
remember
I think there was
correctly.
one last year actually.
Oh, there might have been.
It was like US diplomacy in the West Asia.
Oh, interesting. Yeah. Well, like there's like I'll just like plug like one random source that I think is it's admittedly devastating to watch. Like it's a really sad film, but I think it's like a good example of kind of the hot take implication I'm going for, which is there's a film that was produced by I think it was PBS a few years ago called For Sama, which is basically just like an ethnographic documentary about like one family living in Aleppo during the Syrian civil war. And like, it's not useful to watch the film to win a debate in the sense that there's nothing in the film that could be weaponized into an argument or made into like a debate winning claim. At most, it could be something that you could use to like, I don't know, connect more with the Syrian plight during the civil war and then use that in some sense. And from the perspective of like what can you do with your time that will increase the sort of expected value calculus of winning rounds, it is probably strictly net negative to watch 2 hours of a kind of ethnographic film about the Syrian civil war. And this is tough because like everyone, whether you're in high school, university, pretty much anywhere, like you have deep time constraints. You only have so much time to like research and read. And I actually think there's a lot of value in spending time doing research that will actually have almost no positive effect on your debating because the long-term effects of being more interested in whatever it is that you're debating will actually on balance be like beneficial. So I suppose that the hot take implication of this is it is okay to spend time reading evidence or sources or books or whatever it happens to be that will never win you a debate. And in fact, I think that you should do this like affirmatively, like as like in order to become a good debater, I think you should spend time just reading like qualitative research that cannot be cited or cannot be carded, because it will make you a long-term more interested in the activity debater.
Yeah, I fully agree with that. I think it's just like if people ask how you avoid burnout, for example. I feel like this
Yeah.
is one of the good ways to avoid it. Like recognize that what you're doing has value outside of wins and losses. That value can be so many different things. I've talked about value in debate with lots of other people on this channel, and they always give different answers. But certainly one of the dimensions is like recognize that what you're talking about is real. These people are real. I think that debate, one, like the biggest thing I learned from APTA and from specifically the team that I was on at Brown, and like the people who are older than me, is that debate can be such a catalyst for like actual empathy, if you approach it in the right way. Like people who do debate have a unique ability, I think, that is cultivated over time and practiced to like really try to inhabit the perspective of other people and like, in some ways pretend to be them, but not really, like start to appreciate the concerns that they're talking about and see things from their perspective. I think you could just push that a little bit further. Like each day that you do debate, just try to think a little bit deeper. Like what if that was actually me? Or like how must that actually be? How must that actually feel? How must their perspective actually like matter to them? And what would it be like to believe this kind of thing? And it, obviously, be a little bit selective about this. Don't do this with like the most evil people in the world. Um, but I think like really almost everyone you think about in debate, like all of the actors, they're not just chess pieces, right? They're chess pieces for you on the flow. But that they are real people, and I think that it is worth it to do things like read sources about them, but also just think about them in that way. Like take a moment, take like a minute after you do research and think like, holy crap, those are like real people that we're talking about. They have like actual lives like you and me. And this seems like so trivial, but like people don't do this at all. And it's so easy to yeah to get lost in the sauce, lost in the statistics, um, and kind of gamify everything. Uh, yeah, I there was a debater on my team at Brown that I didn't really know that well. Their name was Sandy. You might know, yeah,
Yeah.
historically like a legend of APTA. And what they would do is put like mood poems at the start of all of their cases. I think this is one of those similar vibes things that can just like set the mood, set the weight that this round has to be slightly higher than just every other win and loss. I was reading some poems about climate change the other day to get in the right headspace to write that climate change at. I think it did some good work.
Yeah,
Um,
that's excellent.
okay, without further ado, I've kept you for a very long time, but I hope you still have a little bit more in you to talk
Oh,
about
absolutely.
a wonderful debate topic. So the PF April topic, the exact wording is resolved the US federal government should substantially increase its investment in domestic nuclear energy. Uh, I'll let you sit with that. My first question is, what are your first impressions on the topic? How would you, if you get this topic, you sit down, how do you approach it?
So my first, like, I suppose my first take is admittedly more empirical, I suspect, than most people's first take would be. But like, so my initial reaction is like this debate just kind of seems like France versus Germany, by which I mean like France and Germany are like two. Admittedly, I haven't like read about this topic like directly, so everyone should like aggressively fact check anything I say on this because this is all just me kind of blabbing based on memory, and memory is very fallible. But hopefully, I will not make any egregious lies. But like France and Germany are like probably two opposite ends of the spectrum on like nuclear energy. So like France is, I don't know what the exact number is, but it's like well over 70% of like France's electricity is just like nuclear. And like Germany just phased out their like last nuclear power plants sometime in 2023 after having like huge public opposition to it. So I suppose that the immediate thought that comes into mind is like there's a lot of interesting like questions of like where on that spectrum do you want to lie. I suspect that there's probably a lot of interesting empirical research also that you can probably look into on like those two cases because they probably do epitomize like in the Germany case like what happens with the complete absence largely of nuclear energy. The France side, a lot of interesting stuff on like the near total dominance of nuclear energy. So I suppose like that's my like first initial reaction is like there's probably lots of interesting parallels to be drawn there in thinking about like the politics of nuclear energy. And there's probably lots of empirical research as well on like the cost effectiveness, for example, of the French electricity system. I had to imagine that it's working out decently well in France, given that France is like a huge exporter, net exporter that is of electricity. So perhaps AF is like yay France, which probably checks out. I suppose like that's my kind of immediate thought. And in terms of like more broadly, how I'd think about like approaching the debate, like I think it's pretty intuitive that you probably end up having like several competing parts of the debate that probably all could be independently weighable, but there are some issues that will just probably dominate. Like, there's obviously one probably core clash, which is the sort of immediate clash on emissions and like kind of carbon intensivity. This is probably just mostly an empirics-based clash, by which I mean like there's probably just a lot of evidence that you can find either way. Although I suspect that there's lots of interesting like evidence to look into. Admittedly, I haven't done the research. So this is me just being like, you should do research on this, kids. But there's probably lots of interesting things as well on like the environmental efficacy of even like renewable energies. Like I think that there's probably lots of interesting things to be said, for example, on like the potential environmental harms that come from like rare earth mineral mining, for example, as like being reasons why like photovoltaic cells might be actually comparatively worse, for example, than other sources of energy. So there's probably one clash, which is like the emission stuff, like how do we best reduce emissions? This is probably just like a matter of like how do you best reduce the use of fossil fuels and in doing so transition towards carbon neutral technologies. There's probably a different part of the debate, which are all of the things that are very specific to nuclear energy. So like the potential, I suppose there are like specific things that you can cite as benefits, like nuclear energy plants are like provide energy for a long time once they're built, which takes forever. But once they're built, they can last for quite some time. There's probably a lot of pro material there, and then obviously like all of the obvious neg stuff, waste, Chernobyl, Fukushima type scenarios to kind of blow up and make sound very scary, all of that. Then there's probably, and there's like probably are some interesting arguments on like the international implications of this. Although I suspect, although I could be wrong on this, I suspect that like a good pro team more often than not can just frame any environmental arguments as being the most important link into any international type argument. Like, I don't
Mhm.
know, maybe Neg has some arguments on I don't know, something on like some arguments about political instability internationally or conflict or proliferation, whatever. There's probably a lot of ways for pro teams, AF teams to be like, actually, we think climate change is a sufficiently bad thing that if we solve it, it has other miscellaneous impacts. And then there's probably like a broader economics clash. Like there's probably a lot of interesting material. I actually have no idea on like the exact literature on like cost effectiveness, but there's probably some interesting cost effectiveness discussion on the costs of implementation, the costs of maintenance, etc. There's probably other things I'm blanking on, but like those seem like intuitively. Oh, there's also like some politics stuff that comes along as well that can be kind of interesting. But like those probably seem like some core-ish parts of the debate, at least as far as I can see.
Yeah, that makes sense. I've talked with a lot of people about like the classic stock issues, like the climate change arguments,
Yeah.
nuclear waste, that like Fukushima, Chernobyl type stuff. I want you to tell me a little bit more about your thoughts on these international issues and maybe on politics as well.
Yeah. So I will preface this by just saying that like I think a lot about nuclear weapons. Like I'm very interested in nuclear weapons. I think that they're a very interesting field of analysis.
Didn't
So I'm
you
probably
write
biased.
some notes about like all
Yeah,
the ways
I
where
wrote
like
some like
like the actual weapon works?
yeah. The notes might be too in depth. They do describe in some detail how to build a nuclear weapon, and I was like, I don't know if I really want this attached to my name, but I haven't been arrested yet, so hopefully that trend continues. So I think that like there are a few ways to think about the topics or like nuclear energy's international implications. Um, so admittedly, I haven't thought a ton about this directly, so this is kind of all me spitballing, but I do think for what it's worth that even though the topic says domestic, like there probably are winning arguments that you can make on the international ramifications. So the part that strikes me the most immediately is like the question of who does the US buy uranium from, is a very boring question, but I actually think has a lot of like interesting material. Like one of the like weirdest fact, I only remember reading about this last year because Biden imposed a quasi ban on this, is like for 3 decades, the US's largest source of uranium was Russia, which is kind of just a wild fact. Like, I really think that like you should not like you specifically, but everyone should be like, well, that is kind of crazy. Like the US and Russia were like have been for decades like selling uranium between them, which I think is a wild fact. But setting that aside, I think there's some interesting questions about where if the US significantly upscales its nuclear energy program, I should specify, its nuclear weapons program is distinct. There's a lot of interesting international arguments to be made there. So realistically, you probably have a few options where you buy uranium from. The US has basically depleted almost all of its domestic uranium reserves by this point. So if it's going to build dozens of new reactors and plants, it probably needs internationally sourced uranium, at least like low enriched uraniums or yellow cake more specifically. So you can probably get it from a couple of places. One option is Russia. If you end up buying a bunch of uranium from Russia. This probably seems bad for like a range of reasons. The most obvious is like fueling Russia's war machine. There's probably some interesting like moral arguments, although those are much harder to sell. But there's a range of reasons why like spending several $billions buying Russian produced uranium is probably bad. I suspect that like a clever neg team could actually do something cool with this. Like there's a really specific argument that admittedly you'd have to find like sources for, but there might be an interesting argument, which is presumably the way the round probably plays out is like AF stands up and is like, here are a bunch of reasons why nuclear is great. Neg stands up and is like, well, have you heard of Chernobyl? And AF stands up and is probably like, well, don't worry about that. We'll have new technologies that solve those problems. There's an interesting way that Neg says, sure, they'll have their cool technologies. One of the big ways, though, that nuclear power plants are intending to become less vulnerable to, say, tsunamis circa Fukushima or meltdowns circa Chernobyl is to shift from using low enriched uranium to high assay low enriched uranium, which is like a slight modification of uranium enrichment process. And one of the weird implications of that, if like Neg makes this argument, which is derived from AF's response. It's like basically the only place, admittedly, I don't know the exact numbers on this, so someone should like look this up, but like one of the only countries that will actually sell high assay, low enriched uranium is Russia. So there might be some interesting arguments that you can make, which is like if you buy the AF response, which is like, don't worry, guys, we have new technology that solves nuclear meltdown. If you just say like, sure, but this requires you to buy Russian uranium because that's how this technology works. There's probably some interesting arguments downstream of that on like, one, bad to fund Russian war machine. Two, it's probably bad for like the US. I guess this is maybe a way for like Neg to like try to flip AF material on like energy security, or energy independence more specifically. Like probably a lot of AF teams will go for like it is good to reduce, for example, reliance on foreign imports of oil. Maybe you flip this and be like, well, now you're dependent on like Putin for uranium, which is probably not great. The other options you probably have to buy uranium are like Canada, Australia, Kazakhstan, and then I don't know, like Niger, like there's a small number of like African countries that have like decent-ish. I actually don't know which number are big. It's really just Australia, Canada, Kazakhstan are like the big three. But there's like some interesting arguments there that you can probably make. So probably the like AF line, I would guess, is like, well, we can just buy a bunch of uranium from Australia and Canada because the US is, well, the US is less chill these days with Canada, but is sufficiently chill. For what it's worth, there might actually be some, admittedly, you'd have to find some pretty specific evidence on this, but there might be interesting arguments on like, given the diplomatic fallout between the US and Canada and potentially in the future the US and Australia, there might be reasons to believe that the US would actually have problems sourcing huge amounts of low enriched uranium from Canada and
Yeah.
Australia. I don't know how true that is real world, but it's possible. At which point you can maybe make like this is like a real stretch. This is a real stretch. Like I'm really stretching here, but I think it's a potentially fun argument. There's like a potentially fun argument, which is like it's bad to buy uranium from Kazakhstan. Um, Probably the like main reason why is like the Kazakh regime, like brief backstory. I forget like the exact dates. I guess it's only like a few dates, but like so back in 2019, the kind of like long-term functional dictator basically of Kazakhstan um, stepped down after like fairly like mass protests. And ever since then, Tokayev, who's their sort of like new president, has governed. He kind of was like kind of chill is maybe the wrong word. He was like kind of a reformist for like 3 years. And then Kazakhstan had these huge protests in the winter of 2022 because the government decided it would relax price caps. So energy prices went up, people protested, a bunch of people got shot and killed by the government. The outcome of that, interestingly, was that the old president was like officially purged from the Security Council, which is like a part of the Kazakh government. Anyways, the reason this is all relevant is like there might be an interesting argument, which is given that there is a functionally authoritarian regime in power in Kazakhstan, and it is dependent is the wrong word, but given that Kazakhstan import or receives lots and lots of money through its state-owned enterprises from the sale of uranium, there might be very specific like Kazakhstan arguments on why like it is just really bad to like fund like a functional like repressive dictatorial regime in Kazakhstan, and why this will result in like mass civilian deaths or like worsening of I don't know. It's like a hyper specific international argument, but it would be really, I don't know, it'd just be really entertaining, I think, if some team was like, our sole disadvantage is on like Kazakh politics and why this will like significantly worsen Tokayev's repression. I just think it would be like a really interesting way to spend an hour of your life. So that's one international angle, although I suspect it requires a lot of links to be proven, and probably not really worth your time too much, but kind of a fun argument, nonetheless.
That is fascinating. This is what happens, I guess, when you spend like half your life doing matter files, then you get access to the Kazakh authoritarian DA on the nuclear energy topic.
Yeah, I think it would be a bit of a hard sell, but there's certainly some interesting things there. So some other interesting like internet. Oh, by the way, these people get increasingly contrived.
Okay,
I'm
I
trying
love
to
it. I
like
love it. I'm here
I'm
for
trying
it.
to
Yeah.
I'm trying to add the things that like I would guess have not already been said, either A in previous videos, interviews, lectures, and B are not already being discussed by other PFers in the world. So
Yeah.
I'm aiming to hopefully add some like kind of wacky stuff into the mix,
Good
whose
stuff.
empirical truth may be suspicious. Um, so there's the argument on like theft I mentioned previously. So the argument is like pretty specific and like it's really hard to find evidence on this for two reasons. The first reason is like probably there's no government or military or security force in the world, certainly not in the US, that will release a lot of information on like the exact details of like here is exactly how scared we are of like terrorists getting nuclear waste stuff. So I suppose I'll like explain the argument as best I understand it. I don't think that there is a viable argument at all on like this will allow terrorists to get a nuclear bomb. This is scientifically crazy. It's like crazy for a bazillion reasons. And the very simple reason why is like the level of enrichment you need to create an actual operable nuclear bomb is way higher than the level of enrichment you need for your run-of-the-mill civilian nuclear power plant. And the reason that's important is that in order to enrich uranium, you need an ungodly amount of energy because you need to put your uranium into a centrifuge and then power the centrifuge, which makes it go whoop-de-whoop-de-whoop in a big, big circle. And if you don't have a lot of energy to do this for a really long time with really high powered centrifuges, and a lot of them, by the way, like Iran has thousands of these things, then you don't actually end up with this. So even if hypothetically, like, I don't know, even if like ISIS took over the entire US nuclear civilian energy program, it would not have any ability to make a nuclear bomb out of it. And it would be pretty crazy to claim that. The argument that could work, again, implausible in the sense of like it is low probability, but if you proved it, it could theoretically be crazy high magnitude, is like there's the potential to create a dirty bomb from nuclear waste. So the distinction between a actual nuclear weapon and a dirty bomb is a dirty bomb is just basically a conventional weapon with radioactive waste added on top. So you have, I don't know, your regular good old-fashioned bomb. Not that there is such thing as a good old-fashioned bomb, but whatever that means to you. And then you add a bunch of radioactive waste or nuclear material on top of it. If you blow that up, now you've basically spread radioactive material over a whole big area. You get radiation poisoning, you get sickness, there's a lot of problems, etc. And the reason why this is bad is most obviously death is not great, cancer is not great. But it's also interesting because there's like a lot of open questions in this in like nuclear and strategic studies about how the United States would respond to a potential use of a dirty bomb in the sense of like it's not a nuclear weapon, but it's the closest thing that the world would have seen to the offensive use of a military weapon since Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945. And that creates a lot of weird implications for retaliation, for the US to blame some government for having played a role in the creation of a dirty bomb. It probably causes huge amounts of over-policing and a massive repressive crackdown, etc. So then the question is, how would a dirty bomb come into existence? Probably the way that you would make the argument, I imagine, on neg is if you have a significant increase in the sort of production of nuclear power plants, nuclear reactors, and most importantly, a huge increase in the amount of low enriched uranium that sort of exists in the United States. There's a lot more opportunities in theory for some of that nuclear material to, in some sense, be stolen. Probably the easiest way to do this would just be like to find wherever or like find some like casket stored nuclear waste and like steal it and then put it into a bomb. You could also, in theory, do this in other ways. Like you could, for example, hijack like a truck that's carrying nuclear material, or you could like theoretically you could try to take over an actual nuclear power plant. But there's lots of problems with this because, as it turns out, there are lots of people who are scared of a dirty bomb coming into existence, and so they've planned for all of these things. So I think the real trick with this argument is not any of the things I've just mentioned, which is like how this could happen or what the harms would be. I actually think the real interesting question of the argument is, could you on neg prove a meaningful set of reasons why the US would be unable to effectively secure its civilian nuclear technologies from potential hijacking or theft from some rogue non-state actor. And this is where you could probably make some really contrived arguments. So
Like
there's one
Doge.
real, yeah, basically this is it. So there's like one like really out there argument, which is like Doge will basically result in like huge and deep cuts to all levels of the federal government, including parts of the federal government that play a very important role in the management of environmental waste. And that means, as a consequence, that there is some risk, for example, that you get like under-policed or understaffed waste sites, especially because the US at present doesn't have a particularly effective centralized way for storing nuclear waste because the whole Yucca Mountain thing never really worked out. So you just have a bunch of on-site storage of nuclear waste. And if you have some reduction in the size of the security forces that are protecting those sites, there is like a argument that you're going to have some rogue white nationalist group seize some nuclear waste and do a bunch of bad things with that. So that's like the tricky part of well, there are many tricky parts of the argument to prove. I lied. That's not the tricky part. It is a tricky part. But if you could prove it, I think it would be it is potentially viable. There are some other like really contrived arguments you can make. One of them that I remember seeing on Twitter, which is a horrible, like under no circumstances should anyone be like, well, this argument is plausible because it was cited on Twitter. But there's like, I guess actually Twitter said two things. So one of them is like Trump will basically just reallocate a bunch of like law enforcement officials towards like political things like deporting undocumented migrants as opposed to like protecting nuclear sites, et cetera. This is like a little hard to prove. The other argument that's like maybe more plausible is like the US might just have a shortage of people who are willing to take jobs that are involved in the. You would need to, in theory, now have tens of thousands of people whose job it is to work with or transport or move or safeguard nuclear waste. And there might be a range of reasons why this would actually be kind of hard to get like sufficient manpower for. The most obvious reason is people just have a very deep and a very visceral fear of anything with the word nuclear attached to it. So it's very plausible, for example, that you end up with like somewhat underprotected trucks that are carrying nuclear waste. And all it takes is, the weighing probably that you would push here is all it takes is one. Like you just need
Yeah.
one truck with one too few security officials around it. And the next thing you know, like the KKK or some rogue like cartel or whatnot has a dirty bomb and things go bad from there. The thing that I think that's a much softer version of this argument that makes all of this less of a concern in terms of like probabilistic analysis is it's plausible that even if this never happens, some group would claim that it has happened. So in other words, like
Mhm.
imagine a hypothetical, you have some rogue quasi-terrorist like whatever group that says we have captured fissile nuclear material, and we are threatening to like detonate it in a major airport and contaminate the entire area for the next like 20 years. Maybe this is completely untrue, but if the US government has spent the last 10 years, let's say it's 2036 or 2035, whenever, having spent a bunch of time building a bunch of nuclear power plants with a bunch of nuclear waste that's filling up the country, and there's just a bunch of potential vulnerable critical points in the process where maybe something got stolen, maybe something got misplaced, maybe it got sold to the wrong person, whatever. If a group makes that threat, you might treat it somewhat seriously, and that has like some weird implications for like, I don't know, the bargaining power that some rogue actors could have. So that
Right.
argument's sus. It's not an international argument directly. The argument that would make it international is like this would probably be fantastic political cover to justify offensive military operations against
Right.
foreign countries that you could easily say like, well, it's Pakistan clearly gave them nuclear material, especially because the US government would never want to admit that it was the US government's fault for like letting nuclear waste fall into the wrong hands. And if 9/11 is anything, it's pretty strong evidence that the US will react to domestic terrorist violence on a large scale with pretty strong and overwhelming
Right.
force. So
Right.
that's a contrived argument, but like,
Before we move on to another one, I have one small
yeah,
question about that. It seems like a lot of the things that you just mentioned are maybe reasons why this could happen even without
yes.
like
Oh, yeah, yeah.
like other countries, the existing nuclear waste in the US, the existing problem of Doge. Um,
Yeah.
how do you beat that like defense?
I think that the way that you would run this, or the way I envision the argument working, is it's sort of a probabilistic claim. Like, suppose today that there is an X% probability that terrorist group seizes control of nuclear waste and does something bad with it. The X is non-zero. Like X, given that the possibility exists, everything I've just said could happen today. X is like strictly greater than zero. The argument I think you would probably make on neg, if you were being most intellectually honest, is a significant increase in the size of the US's civilian nuclear energy program makes X significantly larger.
Mhm.
One reason, the most obvious reason for this, is that there are just many more potential points of failure in the system. There are many more trucks moving, there are many more power plants involved, there are many more waste sites that now need to be managed, which means that you sort of linearly increase the risk. You might also make some variant of that argument that's like, in at least the medium or short term, there's like some stickiness in terms of like this, for example, ability to like effectively manage waste or effectively protect these sites. This is a long-term process that requires a lot of manpower, et cetera. And so perhaps there's like some critical window in time where the US has started building these plants, but it hasn't yet developed effective ways to ensure they're fully safe. I think the more effective argument, though, that you could probably make are to find reasons why there is like a uniquely high risk of nuclear theft moving into the future. And therefore, the very last thing that you would want to do is to significantly increase the number of possibilities for this potential risk to happen. Probably the most obvious reason for this is just like very significant increases in polarization politically
Mhm.
between Democrats and Republicans as a potential reason why there would be a much greater incentive to acquire this. The sussier reason would be like the US, like there's been like this is kind of independent, but like there's some literature that you can cite in like counterterrorism studies that demonstrate that like terrorists' willingness to use nuclear weapons or radioactive material has gone up pretty considerably in the last 2 decades. And maybe you can give reasons why that will continue being true in the future. And therefore, if the opportunity to steal is greater, that's a risk. I think that the problem with all of these, of course, is that there's a problem of uniqueness, which is just to say, A, if all of these arguments are true, why hasn't France already seen a radioactive
Right.
bomb being created? And this is why the argument is contrived, right? Like, there is a lot of truth to the claim that, like, yeah, it's kind of crazy to say that, like, I don't know, like the like Sinaloa cartel is going to get a dirty bomb because the US started building a bunch of nuclear power plants. There are obvious like this argument is almost certainly not going to happen. And thank God it won't, like that would be pretty bad. So good thing it wouldn't. So like the key part of the argument would be like trying to explain why there is something unique about the US government increasing nuclear energy now that would make this problem. I was trying to think about this earlier. The best reason I could theoretically come up with, and this is a stretch, is like there might be some argument which is the distinction between existing nuclear plants in other countries, think France, and the US doing this policy is if the US government were to significantly increase investment into nuclear energy, there might be a political incentive, particularly under Trump, but arguably under any political administration, to make the process as rapid as possible, i.e., to dramatically accelerate the rate at which the US is producing nuclear power plants, building nuclear reactors, transporting uranium into the country, and all of this. The reason being, if it takes 5 to 7 years, let's say, to build a nuclear power plant, there's a political problem at play, which is if you're the Republicans, you want this done, or you want increased power production by 2028 or even 26 more ideally, so you can reap the political benefit of spending billions of dollars on this project. If there is an incentive to make this process go faster, there are then greater security risks, i.e., you are less likely, for example, to very closely scrutinize all of your nuclear sites to ensure that they're fully secure, because your priority is just getting them completed and getting them built. And as a consequence, there might be reasons to believe that safety would be somewhat deprioritized, because if you're the Republicans, your foremost incentive is make energy prices cheaper by 2028 to win the presidency for another term, as opposed to doing whatever is necessarily safest. This might be one potential reason, like why, like for example, there's a difference between a country having nuclear power plants, say France today, versus building a ton of them in a very short window of time. The problem with this argument that's pretty reasonable to point out is like countries build nuclear power plants all the time, and this hasn't happened. And all of those short-termist incentives would equally apply to like what Japan is doing today with building new power plants. There is a very, very contrived response, like very far-fetched, which is like there might be a specific risk of the US significantly doing all of this at once, which is if you devote a ton of money to doing this very, very rapidly, there's a political expectation that you see a very significant benefit
Mhm.
kind of somewhat soon. That's not true of like gradually over the course of several years building up your nuclear power capacity in the way that most countries typically do. So there might be some weird argument on that. So this is a very stretch of an argument, but it is a possible argument, I suppose, is the point.
Makes sense. Um, yeah,
I have,
you
oh
have
yeah, sorry, go
another.
ahead. So I have one more. Although
Okay.
this is probably the craziest. I think I think
Okay.
this is probably the craziest. So it's a real stretch of an argument, like pretty significantly. So I'll give you the short version, and then I'll give you the more detailed version. So the short version of the argument is that there are a lot of countries, specifically today in the age of Trump, that are suddenly thinking about acquiring nuclear weapons of their own. The most obvious would be South Korea, Japan, Poland, maybe Germany is on that list. There are also other countries that are also thinking about this. Iran is the most obvious, but they're probably not meaningfully affected by the debate if they're not involved in like US security agreements because they would might they would be interested theoretically in nuclearizing either way. So the argument basically goes something like this. Lots of governments are suddenly interested in acquiring nuclear weapons because they have security concerns about the reliability of US security guarantees. If the United States makes a sudden pivot or shift this is, I guess, would be an AF argument, I suppose. It's a really weird AF argument for
Mhm.
why you would reduce proliferation. The argument is if the United States suddenly starts buying up huge amounts of uranium yellowcake, very simple economic outcome is that sort of like the economic price of uranium or of most nuclear related technologies goes up pretty significantly, in part because there are huge supply constraints on like just how much uranium can be produced in some window of time. And there's a relative oligopoly of uranium producers, which means that there's an incentive to keep supply somewhat fixed so that prices go up. If prices go up for uranium, for centrifuge technology, et cetera, if those prices go up sufficiently, it actually creates some interesting potential material for, I guess, AF to be like, this in theory might actually deter or at least reduce the political benefits of other countries considering acquiring nuclear weapons. This would require a lot of really delicate link work. But the argument would basically be if you're a major political part, like say you're the LDP in Japan, which is a major political party in Japan, you might have more reservations, even if you want to acquire nuclear weapons, in beginning a nuclear weapon program if the concern is that suddenly the expenses involved in that project are suddenly way higher
Mhm.
because the demand for uranium yellowcake, for centrifuges, et cetera, has gone up significantly. The consequence is if you're a Japanese politician, the cost benefit calculus of pursuing, for example, a nuclear weapons program might in theory be shifted against nuclearization if the short term cost of doing so, i.e., spending way more amounts of money to acquire all of these material, has gone up. Now, the obvious problem with this argument, well, there are many obvious problems with the argument, but like the most obvious is like it's really hard to prove that this would be the thing that stops a country from acquiring nuclear weapons. At
Mhm.
most, it would probably just slow the rate at which countries acquire nuclear weapons, i.e., if Japan really wants nuclear weapons, and it's not clear it does, but it's possible, then Japan would just like do it would just buy uranium, but it would just do this over a somewhat-ish longer period in time, and this wouldn't actually change the net outcome. There might be a really far-fetched response to that, which is on AF, which is like it is good maybe for the process of acquiring nuclear weapons to be longer as opposed to shorter.
Mhm.
Oh, sorry, I lied. I'm speaking on the other side. It's better for the process to be shorter as opposed to longer because the most dangerous period of countries acquiring nuclear weapons isn't once they've acquired nuclear weapons, it's while they're acquiring nuclear weapons. The
Oh
reason
yeah.
why is that when a country is attempting to acquire but hasn't yet acquired nuclear weapons, that's when they're still vulnerable to some first strike by another country because they don't yet have a nuclear deterrent. So, and that's also the point in time where there would be the greatest incentive to launch some conventional military attack. The classic example of this would be like South Korea. So imagine if South Korea is considering getting nuclear weapons and North Korea is kind of not thrilled with that idea. If you're North Korea, you know that the moment South Korea acquires nukes, your ability to stage any type of military operation against the South has gone away because they'll just nuke Pyongyang into radioactive dust. So if you want to do anything that stops South Korea from getting nukes, you have to do it now. And so the risk in theory with prolonging the process of nuclearization is that there's a greater risk of conflict that eventually spirals into hot war. Um, the problem is like if all of this is true, then it might just change countries' calculus to just not nuclearize in the first place, which is maybe like a weird aft turn that's like, yeah, all of this is true, and it's why countries wouldn't nuclearize. The point is like there's a really, really, really far-fetched link chain that you could try to spin out about why this does meaningfully change proliferation. The only other way I think you could somehow link into proliferation would be something about how this would affect the US's nuclear arsenal. The
Mhm.
problem is that the US is already modernizing its arsenal and will do so probably on either side of the debate regardless. So it's probably hard to be like, well, the US will now start or stop building more nuclear warheads, given it's already doing that prior to the AF policy going into effect. There is only one other like this is okay. This is the craziest, like by far the craziest, I think. There's one really crazy argument, which is like if the US develops a very robust domestic nuclear energy industry, you'll get domestic companies in the United States that start producing on a large scale things like batteries involved for the storage of energy that's produced through nuclear power plants, technology that allows for the centrifuging of non-enriched or low-enriched uranium. In other words, you'll get a bunch of American companies that start getting involved in this industry because there's profit to be made all of a sudden. The US government is probably injecting billions upon billions of dollars into it. There's then a really like kind of weird argument, but there is some precedent for it, arguably with Pakistan, where if you get a US domestic industry that makes lots and lots and lots of technologies related to civilian nuclear energy. It's possible that after the United States has kind of completed its nuclear buildup, once those companies have been created, they would then continue producing things like centrifuges or um, reactors, and they would just sell them to other countries. The logic being you have the manufacturing infrastructure to build these things, there's profit to be made. Why wouldn't you just sell this? To be clear, you're selling civilian nuclear energy technologies, like you're selling centrifuges that are designed for civilian purposes to foreign countries. But there is an argument, and this is like a major criticism of the NPT, which is like the big international treaty against nuclear proliferation. There is an argument that some countries do make seriously that there is a risk of proliferation through that. So what I mean by that is if the United States suddenly starts selling a bunch of nuclear related technologies to a whole bunch of countries, those technologies, which otherwise might not be sold on the scale or at the low price that they're now being sold, those technologies actually could be theoretically repurposed for military purposes. So some people, for example, will speculate that like part of why Pakistan acquired nuclear weapons in part is because of a cooperation through a range of like international initiatives, atoms for peace, as sometimes people called it, to basically give things like nuclear reactors to non-nuclear armed countries. And if those technologies can then be repurposed, for example, to enrich low enriched uranium to high enriched uranium, suddenly the technological ability for other countries to consider or actually go nuclear, maybe that capacity goes up. There's a lot of problems with this argument. The simplest is it's non-unique. France already sells nuclear reactors to a bunch of countries. It's not really clear why this would change. The other problem with this argument is it's actually like it is. It sounds really simple that like, well, you have nuclear technology that makes energy, so therefore you can just use the same technology to make big bomb. But it turns out that the technologies actually do differ in meaningful and important ways. Like, for example, the centrifuge capacity that you need to like produce 3% enriched uranium is significantly less powerful than the centrifuge capacity you need to produce 95% enriched uranium, which is probably in the ballpark of what you need for a nuclear weapon. So there's like a science problem at play here.
Yeah.
That being said, if someone can find like decent, I just haven't read enough about this. If someone can find like decent evidence that like the major inhibiting factor for a country to consider going nuclear is the inability to afford cheap civilian nuclear technologies that could be repurposed for military purposes, the argument could potentially work. There is one final thought I have on this, and this is the crazy, like people shouldn't run this because it's really crazy.
Every single time is the craziest
Yeah.
argument.
Well, this argument actually is the craziest, and you'll see why. You can make the previous argument I just made, but impact it in a very different way. The US in AF's world will build basically a bunch of actually let me think. Is this a turn? Let me think actually. They'll build a bunch and then they'll say okay. Okay, so I guess like I guess this would be really, really weird. So never mind. So the argument I'm trying to think through, and I'm trying to figure out if you could like, I'm trying to think of like a really big brain impact turn. The argument would be like if AF says, or I guess Ned could also say this, the US will build up like huge capacity to sell reactors and nuclear technologies to other countries. I'm trying to figure out if there's like a weird way for the other team to just agree that this will happen and then just turn it and say it's good or bad. It probably doesn't end up mattering too much. Um, but like, for example, I suppose like maybe AF, like I guess this is, amplifies all of the arguments that AF and Egg will make anyways. But like, I
Yeah.
suppose there is, for example, a really far-fetched like way for AF to be like, well, even if you think that nuclear power is somehow bad in the US, it might be good elsewhere. And if
Right,
we now
right.
sell a bunch of nuclear technologies to like developing countries that have even worse problems with energy security, then maybe that applies. The problem is like the debate then just gets repeated in the other country,
Yeah.
right? So I'm trying to figure out. I guess what I was trying to figure out with this big brain turn I was referencing is if there's a weird way for a team to concede the argument that the U.S. will start selling nuclear technologies elsewhere, and then be like, we agree that this will happen. We just think that it turns your case against itself, which it probably doesn't. So
Yeah, probably
I
just
don't know, but there's
magnifies,
something there.
like it probably just like
Yeah,
internationalizes the entire debate.
yeah, true.
Um, yeah, okay. I've maybe two more questions, and then I think we should wrap this up. The first
Yeah,
one
fair.
is uh it's funny that you should mention this sort of supply and demand argument. The first one that you mentioned, going back a step about like nuclear proliferation that you mentioned on the AF, I guess. That like if we soak up all of the
Yeah.
yellow cake right now, then like everyone else has less of it, or the demand is still very is much higher than it otherwise would be. Supply stays pretty stagnant, and so suddenly there's like a price spike, maybe internationally. Um, I was actually thinking about the same argument on the neg as a reason that like actually investing in nuclear energy in the US reduces nuclear energy in other places. Now, obviously, the problem with this argument is that it screws you if you're trying to read any other argument on the neg because
True. I
you
guess
can't
this
read
is the
like
big brain turn I was thinking of,
yeah,
right? Like, okay, this is how you could make it. Neg just stands up and says, "We
right.
concede the AF nuclear energy is great, but they stifle nuclear energy
Yes,
elsewhere."
so
So,
I was curious about this. I have done a little bit of work trying to come up with a bunch of reasons why like investment from the US government into the nuclear industry could possibly reduce nuclear energy, either internationally or mostly actually in the US market. Do you think there's any ground that at all would suggest this?
so there is one way to make this argument, which I actually had thought of in a different context that's not price demand or like price supply or demand price related.
Right.
But there might be an interesting argument. Like the argument basically is if you think about what Fukushima did to the global movement for nuclear energy, one nuclear accident in one country caused dozens of countries to shut down dozens of nuclear reactors elsewhere. There's theoretically a really weird, like, I guess this is really hard though, because there wouldn't be an easy way to do this on neg. Like, the argument I'm thinking of is if neg makes an argument that's like, we will, oh, wait, okay, I guess I lied. I guess here's the way you could do it. I guess this is a crazy take. AF says, AF, to be clear, AF, not a misspeak. AF says, this is such a meme argument at this point. AF says, nuclear energy is bad because it will create a bunch of like problems. If the US significantly increases investment into nuclear energy, we'll get like a third Chernobyl slash Fukushima once, but then that will convince every other country to disband
Right.
their own nuclear programs. That's like the insane version of it. There probably must be some way though. Like I think a softer version of it is like there might theoretically be a neg argument that is kind of fair, which is
I mean,
if you could read,
can't you just do that on the neg? Like, the
yeah,
neg
you could.
says the standard accidents
Yeah.
argument and then says this also means that the international community no longer gets nuclear energy as like a solution to climate change.
Yeah, I think that there's also a softer way to impact it on neg, which is there might be an interesting argument, which is if the US has even one nuclear accident or one nuclear meltdown in any capacity, probably the entire US nuclear power program gets shut down almost immediately. Very easy to prove that. I think politically, Japan is an interesting case study in that. Although it's interesting that Japan is now shifting back towards nuclear power, which is like an interesting case in politicians having the capacity to shape political or popular opinions. But there might be, I think, a fair neg line, which is if at some point in the next, particularly like before the program, like before the US has officially brought all of these nuclear power plants online, if you at some point have in that process some issue with like, it could be even something as simple as like a truck is driving through a city carrying nuclear material and it like falls over and it causes like a local contamination crisis
Yeah.
or whatever. It could be something small. Like even if something like if you have something like that, this might create a political problem, which is the entire program gets shut down before AF can get all of their benefits. You could, of
Right.
course, also make the same argument after the program has already begun. The only reason I'm specifying there's a risk of the program getting shut down before power plants go online is AF gets literally zero benefit because
Right.
the power plants haven't yet begun. But you actually do still get some harms, like, for example, all of the harms of like uranium mining. And you get a huge amount of money that just wasted because you've built a bunch of dysfunctional nuclear power plants that now go nowhere. So there might be some weird argument on like opportunity cost.
That makes sense. Okay, I have three last things to say. They should all be quite quick and then we can end
Yeah,
it.
go for it.
Number one, gut instinct. Which side is better?
My gut instinct is AF, but that's maybe wrong.
Okay, number two, if this was BP and not
Mm,
PF, what do you think would be the three most common arguments on either side?
interesting. So I think Gov, argument one, nuclear energy is effective for reducing pollution in the long term. Argument two, the United States has a need for increased energy, particularly for reducing energy security or energy insecurity, not reducing energy security. And maybe some arguments related to like AI, like the need for energy for data centers, et cetera. This seems flippable though. Like there might just be
Mhm.
neg arguments that are like, we think that this is bad, which seems sensible. And probably a third argument on probably there's like a third argument I would guess on like the miscellaneous economic impacts on the US and why this is probably net good for the US economy, job creation, lower energy costs, et cetera. There might also be some interesting political impacts of this. Maybe I've just read too many articles about the Democrats blaming the 2024 election on prices going up, but there's probably a lot of fair things to be said about the importance of reducing like energy prices as a means to
Mhm.
reduce inflation writ large that you can probably blow up pretty significantly. Op, I think everyone will. I think every debater in every format to ever debate this topic probably at some point makes the Chernobyl Fukushima argument. Um, I think that it's admittedly like a good example of an argument that like it's mostly a matter of how well you sell the weighing on the argument. There is like a trivial like non-zero probability of another Chernobyl happening. The probability is also extremely small based on like the vast majority of empirical research, at least that I've seen. So it's mostly like that argument is not the argument. It's like how you would weigh it. And in BP, you would probably weigh it on even if there's a small probability of this happening, that outcome is so disastrous, not just directly, but also the political consequences that you shouldn't even take the risk and you should just spend the money better somewhere else. There's probably other miscellaneous arguments on politics. I think that there is a probably pretty reasonable argument on political backlash and why nuclear energy is widely detested and sort of widely hated. And there is a range of miscellaneous harms that come from spending billions of dollars on a program that's widely opposed. And I think that there's also a very strong argument probably on the like I guess there's like you can sort of do defense slash in BP you would sort of call this mitigation on why the likely trade-off is between nuclear and renewable, not between
Right.
nuclear and fossil fuels. This strikes me as a bit silly because like it is true that there will now be some cases where you build a nuclear power plant where you otherwise would have built a solar farm. It also seems intuitive to me that there will be at least some case where you will build a nuclear power plant and no longer need a coal-fired power plant somewhere along the lines. So you probably still have like a net reduction in emissions in Gov. But if you can do mitigation on the environmental clash, then I think that there's a lot of good impacts that OP would probably go for in BP on harms to indigenous communities, land use, radioactive waste, et cetera, that probably can be weighed like pretty conclusively and pretty effectively. I think that those are probably the arguments that you would most likely see in like a BP round if I had to guess, but I'm just speculating admittedly.
Okay, number three. How would you weigh the nuclear waste argument against climate change? This becomes a problem sometimes in PF because, climate change is so much bigger or whatever. Um, so I'm asking for weighing
Hmm,
from you specifically because I think the way that you compare them in BP, maybe it's a little bit different
fair.
from PF because we're a bunch of consequentialist utilitarian nerds. We need to step away from that a little bit, I think.
So like the classic like I guess it's not really principal weighing, but the weighing that wouldn't be surprising to see a BP or even an APTA team make is there might be a sort of like instrumentalization claim, and the claim would basically be that climate like reducing climate change is a good goal and probably on a utilitarian calculus matters more than the harms of say indigenous communities facing high rates of cancer as the consequence of nuclear waste dumping. The problem is that it is wrong in principle to instrumentalize an indigenous community in the United States to pursue the broader holistic goal of solving climate change globally. The kind of like rough analogy that you might draw in your head is there are lots of policies that the US could implement that would significantly reduce global poverty abroad, but would be devastating for minorities or for low income communities in the United States. Like, for example, in theory, the United States could like enslave a bunch of people to just do a bunch of labor that like develops, for example, climate change fighting technologies or significantly reduces the price of food and reduces global food insecurity, et cetera. But most people think that that would be wrong because it would be wrong to use one marginalized group for another group's benefit, even if that group is larger in scale and also vulnerable. There might be like a kind of like it is worse to do an active wrong than to permit a passive harm. I think the second strategy that you would see a lot of BP debaters use, I would probably use this as well, is like BP debaters will often call this like the kind of strategy of like strategic washing of if you can try to come up with some list of reasons why increasing the use of nuclear energy might potentially have bad impacts on other emissions policies. Like, for example, if you can make some argument about why like I'll just give like one simplest example. Suppose you can make some argument that proves that increasing the use of nuclear energy will result in fewer Democrats being elected federally, which results in even worse gutting of the EPA, worse like overturning of the Inflation Reduction Act, et cetera. You can give some various reasons why this will end up causing other policies on climate change to get worse. If the link level clash on climate change is inconclusive, or it's relatively unclear which side is marginally winning the clash on reducing emissions and solving climate change, then there's probably a fair claim that the relatively more certain margin of change on like a probability times magnitude calculus is nuclear waste material, because even though the magnitude of climate change is greater than the magnitude of nuclear waste, the probability that AF is the team that is ahead on climate change is relatively contested, and absolute most 50%, versus the marginal probability that op is right, or in this case, neg is right on nuclear waste, is probably close to 100%. And so if you can do some targeted weighing on that, it could probably be fairly useful. You could probably also do like other sort of miscellaneous weighing, which is I really dislike the weighing that's like, well, climate change is going to happen anyways, therefore, we shouldn't do something about it. I think the more reasonable way to do that type of weighing is to instead say, the debate is not solve climate change in AF and cause environmental damage to indigenous communities in OP. The real question is there is some marginal reduction in emissions in AF's best case. Like, I don't know exactly what the number is. Maybe it's 1%, maybe it's 2%. Realistically, that marginal reduction has some range of benefits. Like, for example, less air pollution means fewer people die because air pollution causes people to die and all of that. If on neg you can make it appear that the size of that marginal change, like the degree to which emissions are reduced in Gov, is relatively small, then there might be some miscellaneous like arguments that you can make at a weighing level, which are like the marginal benefit vis-a-vis climate change from AF is less in scale than the very concentrated and intense harms that we would identify towards indigenous communities. There's also a sussier way to do this, which is like a marginal increase in emissions would merely intensify the ongoing harms of climate change, which is bad, but that's less bad than inflicting entire destruction on indigenous communities who otherwise wouldn't face that destruction. The last way that I think you could weigh it, and this would get really weird, but I suspect a lot of pro teams will run A, arguments on climate change, and B, arguments on economic growth. Like they'll make some arguments about like creation of jobs, creation of economic opportunities in the United States, et cetera. You could probably find some literature on why like degrowth is good, i.e., you might be able to find some arguments that are like it is maybe bad to have the economic growth that AF is describing, because the economic growth that they describe will result in an increase in demand for fossil fuels independent of the increased nuclear capacity. So in other words, like, I don't know, I'll make numbers up. Suppose you increase economic activity by 100 units. The fact that you have nuclear energy in play now maybe means that 40 units of that economic activity can be powered or transported or heated or sustained or electrified by nuclear means, but 60 of it that's now in creation but otherwise wouldn't have been in creation is now powered through fossil fuels. So maybe the net outcome is an increase in the use of fossil fuel. This would be a really weird like derivatives argument about the
Right.
rate at which nuclear energy replaces fossil fuels is less than the rate at which the economy grows and therefore contributes to increased energy demand. Like if energy demand goes up by 200% and fossil fuels share of the overall energy pie goes down by 25%, you might still have an net increase in fossil fuels. The point is, if you can make it appear that the clash on emissions slash climate change is sufficiently indeterminate that there's no clear margin for AF slash gov, then the very definitive harms towards indigenous communities probably matter the most. There's one last way you could weigh it. I'm sorry, this is going on forever, but there might be a miscellaneous argument that I don't think is a big thing in PF, but would be an argument that you would see in BP, which is there might be arguments on how this will affect the environmental movement and its ability to advocate for political change outside of nuclear energy policy. So a common argument you would see probably in BP is like, if the US government embraces nuclear energy, this will cause A, blowback against the environmental movement, who might be perceived as in some way aligned with this. But more importantly, B, this will probably cause huge fragmentation within the environmental activist cause. There are tons of environmentalists, think Greenpeace, who are deeply opposed in many cases to nuclear energy. They'll now be fiercely divided over whether to support or oppose or to work with or to reject and protest against the creation of nuclear power plants. Some environmentalists are pro it, others are against it. Right now, this might not be a major divisive point because it's not a huge issue in US politics and not being spent billions of dollars on. If you fragment the environmental cause, the consequences are reduced political slash social capacity to mobilize for environmental change. If you have a less effective environmentalist movement, then you're less likely to get miscellaneous environmental reforms and other issues, think car emissions, etc. The trick with this argument that would be pretty hard is like this argument would have to be made in like a long-term sense because it seems pretty implausible that Trump is going to be particularly persuaded by like environmentalist arguments, and the Republican Party doesn't seem either. But the argument you could theoretically make is like if in the next 20 years the environmental movement loses, again, making numbers up, 20% of its buy-in, and that means as a consequence you get worse defunding or worse gutting of environmental regulatory agencies and environmental legislation, then this adds even further uncertainty. So in other words, I suppose the point I'm trying to make is like if you can create reasons, not just mitigation reasons, not just like, oh, they don't solve climate change by as much as they say, but if you can give independent reasons why nuclear energy might end up causing environmental harm, then you can at least weigh up the clash on climate change as somewhat link level inconclusive, and then perhaps weigh the argument on nuclear waste being more impactful. And just to be clear, the way you could like link the nuclear waste argument into that is you can cite nuclear waste being dumped on indigenous communities as a reason why the environmental movement would be divided on this, because you'd have
Right.
lots of environmentalists who are also concerned about indigenous rights, and when indigenous rights activists are now divided within the environmental cause, this weakens the movement, which is perhaps a reason why nuclear waste. Like, I guess the technical way of putting this is like, if you think the environmental cause is key towards solving climate change outside of just this specific debate, then like the controlling link for how you maximize the internal unity of the movement is whether or not you force environmentalism to be oppositional towards indigenous rights.
That makes sense. Well, thank you so much, Ryan. You've given me plenty to think about, both in debate and nuclear energy in particular. I hear you have a cool charity thing going on right now. Do you want to plug that?
Oh yeah, I'll plug it randomly. Maybe we can like link it in the description for
Yeah,
anyone who's
yeah.
interested. So I'm running a series of workshops. They'll be short. Well, oh, sorry, the workshops won't be short. In case you haven't noticed, I have a tendency to be a big fan of talking about debate. But like the workshops will run for like 2-ish weeks. I'm doing a handful of workshops on topics that are probably most relevant for, I guess actually they have some relevance for probably future PF topics. I doubt that any of them will be specifically relevant for nuclear energy. I'll do a workshop on finance, a different one on American politics, one on sort of international relations, and then one specifically on like researching and building a matter file, which will be a much more like in-depth explanation of what I sort of alluded to earlier. All you have to do is donate some money to either the Malaria Consortium or the Humane League. Malaria Consortium does a lot of cool work with malaria prevention and a whole range of health initiatives. The Humane League is an animal sort of a movement against factory farming. They do a lot of good lobbying and advocacy work. There are a lot of people far smarter than I who have done a lot of like cool computation on why these charities are very effective. If you Google like effective altruism plus Malaria Consortium or Humane League, you can find godly long papers on why. But if anyone would like to do it, it would be very cool. It's going to a good cause, so it'll be lots of fun.
Yeah, sounds awesome. Thank you so much for everything that you've done in this interview. We've gotten 2 hours out of you, so thank you for the
Love
generosity
it.
of your time, and I hope to see you soon. Okay,
Yeah, thank you so much.
bye-bye.